An 18-year-old student visited her family for the holidays, but a few days later, she vanished without a trace. The police got involved after her mother started receiving strange messages. None of them were ready for the truth they learned during the investigation, which truly shocked the entire family. On August 9, 1996, a Norfolk, Virginia suburb welcomed Angelica Hadsell into the world. She soon gave birth to 2 younger sisters, but when her parents got divorced in 2005, the girls stayed with their mother. Angelica had 3 younger sisters, who she got along well with after her mother remarried in 2010. They had another daughter. In Farmville, Virginia, about 3 hours away, Longwood University accepted Angelica after she graduated from a nearby high school. In addition to joining 2 sports teams, she also had a year-early graduation goal and had to work quickly to meet it. She continued to travel to Norfolk to see her sisters and parents on a regular basis. Despite this, when Angelica was 18 years old, she visited her family in March 2015 with the intention of staying for a few days during her spring break. Angelica was delighted to be able to return to her family, was in a good mood, and enjoyed spending time with them. She got her 3 younger daughters ready for school the next morning, March 2nd, and then left to go to work, leaving Angelica at home by herself. But when her mother came home from work in the afternoon, Angelica was gone. The back door was open, music was playing, and only a few of her belongings were put into the washer, giving the impression that she had left quickly. This puzzled her mother because she and her daughter were always in contact, and she expected Angelica to let her know if she was going somewhere. However, on this particular day, Angelica didn't answer her phone, so her mother wrote to her and inquired as to where she had gone. When asked where she had gone on her walk with friends, Angelica replied that she had gone for one, but she didn't say specifically where. They then messaged back and forth about when Angelica planned to come home, and this time her mother noticed something odd once more. She claimed that the messages from her daughter were written in a very distinctive manner compared to how she was used to. Normally, Angelica would send her detailed messages with all the pertinent information, but this time she only got brief, ambiguous messages. Despite this, the young woman's mother did not have any unfavorable suspicions, because she believed that the young woman simply wanted to hang out with her friends and that she was already 18 years old. Angelica didn't return home on that day, but she answered her messages anyway. She continued to evade questions about her location and her intended return time for the remainder of the day, though without providing any clear answers. Eventually, the daughter stopped responding to her mother. She then made the decision to contact Angelica's friends, but was disappointed to learn that no one had seen her and had any idea of where she was. The mother contacted police detectives that evening on March 3rd, after making the decision to do so. The young woman appeared to have left of her own free will at first. A note found in the house soon provided evidence in support of this version. It was probably written in Angelica's handwriting, according to Angelica's mother. One sentence is all there is. Angelica wrote that she needed some alone time with herself because of everything going on in a very strangely worded note. Her family could not comprehend what she was trying to say. She was a happy young lady who studied all her spare time and planned her future. She never made any significant life announcements, so the note seemed pointless. The fact that Angelica left her clothes, wallet, and car at home was also discovered by the police, which already refuted the claim that she left on her own initiative. There was, however, nothing to suggest the opposite at the time. A piece of Angelica's credit card was discovered nearby by Cody, a neighbor who lived close to Angelica's family, several days after the investigation began. He told the police about it, and that's when he was named as the prime suspect. He was questioned by detectives for 12 hours because they believed he might be connected to her disappearance. The police did not immediately drop their suspicions despite his denial of guilt. Additionally, according to Angelica's family members, by that point everyone in the neighborhood was aware of the case, and many people were attempting to aid the investigation. Teams were formed to scour the area for any proof, and everyone started to suspect Cody. After the credit card incident, It was discovered that he and Angelica went to the same university and dated for a while. Soon after, something else happened that seemed to link him to her disappearance. The situation changed quite strangely less than a week after the investigation started, when Wesley Hadsall, Angelica's stepfather, stormed into Cody's home and discovered Angelica's jacket there. Wesley, who was helping her friends find his daughter while they were searching for her, instructed them to go to Cody's house and search there for Angelica's belongings because he thought the boy was responsible for her disappearance. The friends went to Cody's house and did exactly that. They discovered her jacket there and immediately informed the police. Again being questioned, Cody was under tremendous pressure. Despite this, Cody claimed he had no idea where the investigators were, extremely perplexed. The detectives had a strong feeling that the boy was telling the truth during the interview, despite the fact that the jacket and Cody's home were both very important pieces of evidence. The most crucial thing he did was offer an alibi for the day of Angelica's disappearance, in addition to voluntarily giving his DNA sample, taking a polygraph test, and agreeing to anything else they asked of him. He may actually be innocent, the police concluded after investigating this information. Wesley, Angelica's stepfather, gave them the tip. They told Angelica's friends, who had found the jacket. With this knowledge, the detectives acknowledged that the man might have planted the jacket. The key question was, why would he do that? Wesley's involvement in his daughter's disappearance was the most likely explanation. When the police started looking into his background, they discovered that he had been charged with and found guilty of more than 10 offenses, all of varying degrees of seriousness. He was frequently detained for robbery, drug use, and possession. In 2005, he abducted his own wife and brutally treated her for a number of days. In any case, the court was unable to establish his guilt, so he was spared any significant penalties. Throughout his life, he had spent a number of times and years in prison. The investigators also learned that Wesley's mother had expelled him from the home a few weeks prior to Angelica's disappearance because he had begun abusing strong, illegal substances. He'd been staying in hotels ever since. He was a serious suspect in light of everything that had happened. When asked when he last saw Angelica during the interrogation, the man insisted that he had nothing to do with her disappearance and that he was actively looking for her. Around noon on the day of her disappearance, Wesley claimed to have seen her at a gas station. The detectives looked over the video from the gas station cameras and couldn't find any evidence to back up the young woman's request for a few $100s before they split up. Wesley's co-workers at work said he had taken a few hours off that day because his daughter had asked him for money. Around 2 p.m., he went back to work, nervous as ever. In his statement, there was a clear inconsistency. Wesley claimed to his co-workers that he had to leave because his daughter had requested money, but he admitted to the police that he had unintentionally seen Angelica at the gas station while driving by. There was no reason for Angelica to be at the gas station. Her car was parked close to her house. Wesley explained that the alarm had gone off at the home where he had been living prior to the argument with his wife when asked why he had left work that day. He also mentioned that he had received a notification on his phone. This information was not corroborated by the police, and it did not account for the blatant inconsistencies in his statement. In order to search Wesley's motel room, where he had been residing for the previous few weeks, the police next obtained a warrant. Interestingly, they discovered, because of his numerous convictions, Wesley had been maintaining a large number of guns and bullets. He was arrested right away because it was illegal for him to possess weapons. Wesley was accused of 3 crimes: illegal possession of a weapon, breaking into Cody's house, and tampering with evidence because of the jacket he allegedly planted in his room, even though there was no evidence pertaining to Angelica there. He continued to maintain that he was doing everything in his power to locate his daughter, despite having no involvement in her disappearance. As a result, the court gave him a 20-year prison term, and the detectives kept looking for the young lady. The most intriguing thing they found when they seized Wesley's work vehicle was the GPS navigator, which they sent for analysis to specialists. They also discovered shovel tape and dark gloves inside. According to the information they had on March 4th, The detectives were interested in learning where Wesley had gone in the days following Angelica's disappearance. Wesley left Norfolk and traveled 90 kilometers to a nearby town. He then returned to his job after parking his car somewhere for 20 minutes. On April 9th, the detective arrived at the scene and found his car parked in a remote area close to an abandoned house. They finally located Angelica's body in a nearby ditch after searching the area. Even though she was protected by a piece of plywood, it would have been extremely challenging to stumble upon her, because the area around the house was overgrown and inaccessible. As a result, no one could have done so. An unexpected statement was waiting for everyone after the body was sent for a medical examination. Participants discovered a level of illegal substances in the young woman's blood that was 3 times the amount that would have been fatal for a typical person, according to the results of the process. The shocked members of Angelica's family. The young lady was involved in sports, almost exclusively studied, and didn't even drink alcohol. She was not taking any illegal drugs, which no one could believe. A second round of tests was chosen by medical professionals. It is possible to tell if someone has used narcotic drugs in the past by looking at their hair, and this analysis revealed that Angelica had never had any experience with illegal drugs. Because of this, it was virtually impossible to believe that she would suddenly decide to take a triple dose of medication. A piece of plywood was also placed over her body after it had been buried in the ditch. Everything pointed to the possibility that these drugs were administered to the young woman against her will, with the intention of killing her while making it appear as though it was an accident. Wesley was interrogated by the detectives once more. When Angelica's body was discovered, the first thing they asked the man, who was already in prison at the time, was what his work car was doing nearby. The man's explanation, to put it mildly, was implausible. He claimed that he might have been set up and that he didn't go there on his own. He had additionally stated earlier that only he had access to this vehicle. Wesley even suggested that someone might have stolen his car's navigation system, driven to that residence, and then returned the device while the police gathered evidence. They were able to locate several recordings that demonstrated Wesley was in the city, where his daughter's body was discovered on the same day, driving his work car from a number of street cameras situated along the route to this house. Even though everything pointed to the man being involved in the murder, the court still required additional proof, so the police worked on this case for several more years in an effort to gather indisputable evidence. Wesley was only charged with Angelica's murder at the end of the investigation because of this. According to the prosecution's account of events, the primary court hearing started in January 2022. Wesley went to the house on March 2nd, where Angelica was staying, with the sole intent of robbing her and using her as a pawn in other violent crimes. He had planned to make it look like an accident, but instead, he took her out of the house, carried out his plan, and gave her a triple dose of drugs. The man had carefully thought out his plan. The police discovered repeatedly during countless interrogations his denials and made every effort to discredit himself. The prosecution was successful in locating a witness who corroborated their story. This witness sold Wesley the same illegal substances that killed Angelica. Additionally, the court heard that the location information from Leslie's phone and Angelica's phone were compared after the police discovered Angelica's phone on the street. Her phone had been next to Wesley's since the young woman vanished, even when messages were sent from her mother's account. It was clear from this that Wesley had taken Angelica's phone and was attempting to reassure Angelica's mother that everything was fine, insisting that their client was innocent. The defendant's attorneys, they said Wesley had nothing to do with it, that the girl was depressed and had decided to take her own life. This account omitted any information regarding who buried her and covered her with a piece of plywood, or why his car was found close to the location where her body was discovered. All of these defenses attempted to account for either coincidences or attempts to frame Wesley. Interestingly, despite having previously stated numerous times that he did not accept the overdose theory and thought Angelica was murdered, the man's opinion changed in court for an unknown reason, and the jury arrived at a decision in less than an hour. Wesley was convicted of murder and given a life sentence. The man stated that he would contest the judgment, and theoretically, he stands a good enough chance of succeeding in having the judgment reversed. As you might have guessed, there isn't a single physical piece of evidence against him. For instance, DNA evidence of his guilt would have been virtually unassailable if it had been discovered on the victim's body. Wesley's work vehicle was actually found close to the location where the young woman's body was later discovered, which is the main defense argument. The fact that this person abducted and violently treated his wife 10 years prior to the incident raises doubts about any of his other arguments, though none of them are particularly strong proof. Does the defense have any stronger evidence, or does the prosecution's version seem to be more convincing? Might very well succeed in getting a new hearing by contesting this decision. Your thoughts? Wesley is allegedly responsible for the murder, or is he unrelated? Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching.
In this video, we'll discuss crimes perpetrated between 1996 and 2014. Despite the wide time span, all of these crimes had one thing in common. They were all committed along Virginia's Route 29, a major thoroughfare. The police looking into these crimes made several attempts, some of which were successful, to connect the incidents in some way. Some of the criminals referenced in this video may have already come up in separate investigations, though. Here, we'll try to look at the events from the standpoint of several offenses. In 1996, more than 20 women went to the police and said they had all been chased by a man in a pickup truck on Virginia's Route 29. He would communicate an issue with their automobiles and flash his headlights. A white male between the ages of 35 and 45 with reddish-brown hair who was driving a pickup vehicle was characterized as this individual. He earned the moniker Route 29 Stalker, 25-year-old Alicia Reynolds. Alicia Reynolds said her husband Mark Farewell on March 2, 1996, at 7:30 in the morning in Baltimore, Maryland, and left for Charlottesville, Virginia. She had a meeting with her mother scheduled for 10:30 a.m., but she had nearly 150 miles to travel. She held off till 11:30 a.m. Alicia's mother contacted her husband Mark, but did not hear from her daughter. Mark informed her that Alicia had departed 4 hours prior, and that by that time, even without rushing, she should have arrived. After making the decision to call the police, Alicia's car was eventually discovered at 6 p.m. on the side of Route 29. Despite being close to Culpeper, Alicia was nowhere to be found. When the car was inspected, there were no indications of a crime, and afterwards, specialists said the car was mechanically fine. What caused the young woman to leave her automobile unattended is unknown. An inquiry was launched. Soon, witnesses who had observed Alicia conversing with a man in a blue pickup truck on the side of the road were located. The alleged first victim of the stalker on Route 29 is Alicia Reynolds. All the women who had been pursued by the man in the pickup truck before she vanished and who hadn't previously recognized they were in danger came forward to the police and related their interactions with the unidentified pursuer after she vanished. It was discovered that 3 other ladies had previously dated in addition to Alicia. 2 of them were delivered to their destinations in the pickup truck, but the third woman, Carmelita Shomo, was not. Sadly, no picture of her could be located. A week before Alicia vanished, Carmelita stopped at his request. She saw someone flashing their headlights at her in the rearview mirror as she was traveling home from work on Route 29 that wet night. She stopped, and the pickup truck's driver followed suit. She was said there were sparks as the man approached her after getting out of his car. He then offered to give her a ride home, and she consented, telling him that it was coming from underneath her car while she was driving, and that it might be unsafe to keep using it. The pickup truck stopped on the side of the road after a brief trip, and the woman was then attacked. Despite having a fractured ankle, she was able to get out of the pickup truck and draw the attention of oncoming traffic, which startled the driver and caused him to speed away. However, Carmelita, an immigrant with poor English language, reported the event to the police. At that moment, no steps were done to identify the pickup truck driver due to the police officer's dismissive attitude and lack of respect for her word. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, the police were unaware that their incompetence would eventually result in a tragedy for the Reynolds family. 2 months after going missing, Alicia was not located. Her body was located 15 miles from where her car was found, in a forested location. Laura Winans is 26 years old, and Julianne Williams is 24. May 1996, the same month that Alicia Reynolds' remains were found again, saw the father of Julianne Williams call the police on May 31st to report his daughter missing. She hadn't arrived at the appointed time since she and Laura Winans were on vacation in Shenandoah National Park. They were last seen extending their stay at the campground on May 24th at around 5:30 p.m. Following the police report, park rangers found the two women's bodies the following day. They were both killed by incisions to their necks and the binding of their wrists. Authorities gave May 28th plus or minus 30 hours as the date of death. It was discovered that there had been no sexual activity before the victims' deaths, and their possessions were still in their tent. We shall return to this incident later. This motiveless crime baffled detectives, and the authorities were unable to crack the case right away. Sophia Silva, 16, is a teenager. On September 9, 1996, 3 months later, 16-year-old Sophia Silva vanished from her yard in Spotsylvania County, without leaving any evidence of a struggle. Numerous searches. Sadly, it didn't produce any results.
Her remains was discovered in a King George County creek a month later. The test found that Carolyn McDaniel was 20 years old, and that Sophia Silva had also experienced sexual assault before to her death. 20-year-old Anne Carolyn McDaniel left her home in Orange and vanished 12 days after Sophia Silva was kidnapped. Occasionally, hitchhiking was something Carolyn McDaniel enjoyed doing. She was last saw hitchhiking on the road on September 20th, 1996. Her burned bones were discovered 2 days later, located in Culpeper County, only 15 miles from the location of Alicia Reynolds' body. Katie Lisk was 12 years old, and Kristen Lisk was 15. Despite the police's best efforts, 7 months had gone since Anne Carolyn McDaniel's death was discovered, and none of these crimes had any solid suspects. In the meantime, Spotsylvania, where Sophia Silva was kidnapped on May 1, 1997, was shaken by a fresh incident. Kristen Liske, 15, and her sister Katie, 12, went missing. The girls would typically contact their father when they got home from school because he was at work at the time. On this particular day, though, the father didn't hear from his girls, so he began making calls home. He went home right away because there was no response. None of the nearby residents had seen the girls, and they were nowhere to be found. The girls had come back, as shown by the bag with their school books that had been placed on the grass. But something had transpired since I got there. In the wake of it, a police report was made, and some 1,500 people joined the hunt for the girls. Their bodies were found in the South River, 40 miles from their house, 5 days later. The test revealed that drowning was the cause of death. Strangely, the water discovered in their lungs was probably clear tap water, much like in Sophia Silva's case. In their last moments, the girls' sexual integrity had been compromised. The types of crimes and some supporting evidence shown that a single person was responsible for these crimes. A Canadian visitor was riding in Shenandoah National Park on July 9, 1997, when she heard the sound of an approaching automobile. She was expecting the car to drive past, but it didn't. She noticed that the car was approaching her in an odd manner. The pickup truck's driver tossed a soda can at her before getting out and ordering her to take off her clothes. The woman tossed a water bottle at him and used her hands to block his path as he approached her. He tried to drag her into the car, using the bicycle as a barrier, but when he realized he couldn't, he got back in the driver's seat and tried to run her over. Being discouraged by yet another failure, she managed to hide behind a downed tree. The woman saw it as hell when a ranger just so happened to be walking by. He immediately radioed a description of the vehicle, a blue Chevrolet truck, and the person who was arrested as they were leaving the park. The culprit was identified as a 28-year-old man. On April 10, 2002, Daryl David Rice received his sentence of 11 years and 3 months in jail after pleading guilty to the attack in March 1999. In relation to the instances of Laura Winans and Julianne Williams, Rice was charged. To refresh your memory, The young women's deaths were reportedly expected to occur around May 28th, give or take 30 hours. It was discovered that Rice entered the park at around 8 o'clock in the evening by reviewing surveillance camera footage from that time. Dated May 25th. He returned to the park the following day at 5 p.m. and was seen on camera visiting the park on June 1st, 1996, the day the young women's bodies were discovered. Rice knew he would likely receive the death penalty, so he hired a strong defense team that eventually had the accusations against him withdrawn. A hair discovered on the sticky tape used to bind the young woman was later determined through new DNA testing technologies to not belong to Rice. He was cleared of those charges in April 2004 due to insufficient evidence. But Rice's legal struggles were far from ended. The blue pickup truck he was driving when he was stopped belonged to his father, who resided close to Highway 29 in Virginia and was accused of being the Route 29 stalker. His attorney expertly handled the problem once more. When Rice was named as the attacker during the 2005 trial, Carmeliere Shomo, the woman who had successfully resisted the attack and broken her ankle in the process, pointed to a completely different person when she was shown photographs of men for identification prior to the trial. Years ago, in the middle of the night, the defense was able to sow a seed of doubt in her mind, making her wonder if Rice was the criminal. The defense team successfully exploited this uncertainty, which led to the charges being dropped. Additionally, there was no evidence linking Rice's actions to the Alicia Reynolds case, which is regarded as an incident involving the Route 29 stalker. Cases of harassment on the highway were only seized following Reynolds' disappearance. Additionally, nothing suggested Rice's involvement in the incidents in question, Spotsylvania and Orange. Despite numerous circumstantial evidence that the Route 29 stalker was in fact him, it was impossible to prove. As a result, the identity of the driver of the pickup truck that scared women is still unknown. Even with the given prize, the police made a concerted effort to solve these crimes, but they were unable to come any closer to the offender. 15-year-old Carol Robinson was at her friend's house on June 24, 2002, in Columbia, South Carolina, while an acquaintance showered. When a man with some pamphlets in his hands approached, Kara was watering the flowers in front of the house. He requested that Kara give her parents the items. He held a gun to her neck as she walked up to him and told her to get in his car. When he brought Kara to his house, she was chained and repeatedly forced to have sex, while the kidnapper was fast asleep. Kara was able to free herself, make her way outside, and eventually find a police station. She had been held captive at the station for 18 hours. Everything she recollected helped the police find her abductor, but by that point, he had managed to escape. The perpetrator was identified as Richard Mark, 38, an honorable man who appeared to be just like everyone else. Mark is a former member of the military who is married and works. He had left the Navy in 1987 after being exposed to a 15-year-old girl and her 3-year-old sister, it was learned. For this offense, he was given a 3-year sentence with probation. He was captured by the police in Sarasota. Ivana made the decision to commit suicide after realizing he had no other option and was marked by a gunshot and a burst of light. It was determined that he was involved in the cases of Sophia Silva, Kristen, and Katie Lisk, after inspecting his home and comparing the available evidence. The threads on the corpses of the ladies were an exact match to the strands on his bathroom carpeting. It's unbelievable, but forensic specialists were able to locate Kristen Lisk's fingerprints in the car's trunk 5 years after the crime. DNA testing. By examining the facts, it was finally determined who killed Sophia Silva Kristen and Katie Lisk, and it was also shown that his early life had a big impact on who he would become. When Mark was 6 years old, his father Joseph was giving him a bath, and water went into his eyes, causing him to scream. Mark's father Joseph was an alcoholic, and his mother was openly having affairs with other men. Joseph was enraged by this, and the child at the time claimed that his father intended to drown him. Family members claimed that Joseph also drowned, leaving their dog's Mark right in front of him. The pattern of his subsequent crimes is thought to have been influenced by this event, drowning his prey. Additionally, he was looked into for possible connections to the incidents on Route 29 and the Alicia Reynolds case, but none were found. Reports of the Route 29 stalker ended once the witnesses were dead, and Rice was incarcerated serving his sentence. But soon after, girls started reporting it again. Started vanishing once more in Virginia in 2005. An unidentified 26-year-old woman from Fairfax, Virginia, was being carried into a wooded area after being attacked from behind on Rock Garden Drive, while she was returning home on foot from a nearby store. Dark and poorly populated, it was already. She fought back vehemently and shouted, but the attacker eventually overwhelmed her around 10 p.m. He coerced her into a sexual act before starting to choke her. Thankfully, a bystander who was nearby heard the woman's cries and ran to help. The attacker made it away, and the police were able to collect a sample of his DNA. They also produced a composite sketch, but they were unable to capture him using this information right away. On October 10, 2009, Cassandra Morton, at age 23, was in Lynchburg. Cassandra Morton, age 23, vanished. She was last spotted on Park Avenue, which is located in Lynchburg's downtown. The only information the police could find when her family reported her missing was that she got into a black car with someone. Her remains were discovered 6 weeks later. Her body had been strewn with rocks by a passerby who had just passed by the last spot she had been seen. 20-year-old Morgan Dana Harrington was last seen in Lynchburg 7 days after Cassandra Morton vanished. Morgan Dana Harrington, age 20, vanished in Charlottesville, a nearby city 70 miles distant. On that terrible day, October 17, 2009, she was a student at a technological university. She and her pals went to see Metallica perform. When his opening band was on stage, she informed her friends that she would use the bathroom and then come back. Her pals were concerned because she had been gone for a while. When they called her at 8:48 p.m., she replied that she was outside the arena but was prohibited from entering due to the no re-entry rule. She also indicated that she was going home, but nobody seemed to think about how she would get there for some reason. No one can figure out why she left the arena since she never came back. She said that she needed to use the restroom, yet there are facilities inside the arena. It's still unclear how she got outside, or either it is genuinely unknown, or it is kept quiet for image purposes. Her wallet and phone were discovered the following day in a parking area close to the arena. 2 months later, on January 26, 2010, witnesses were located who had seen a young lady who resembled Morgan Harrington voting at a nearby bridge. A farmer in Albemarle County, 10 miles from the arena where the performance was held, found her bones. Later, the daughter's parents admitted that she was coerced into having a sexual encounter in the final moments of her life. Samantha Ann Clark, 19, vanished in Orange on September 13, 2010, when she was 19 years old. When Samantha left the house at 1:30 a.m. on the day of the incident, her mother Barbara was working the night shift. Her younger brother, who was 12 years old, stayed at home with her. He called his mother to let her know Samantha had left. When Barbara got home the next morning, she found her daughter's pajamas lying on the bed, indicating the teenager had changed before leaving. Admonish Samantha about threats he'd heard from friends. At the time, Taylor was not connected to Samantha Clark's disappearance in any way that the police could discover. The investigation came to a halt since the phone calls were insufficient to support any charges. Age 19 for Saga Smith. Saga Smith, 19, vanished in the same Charlottesville, 3 years after Morgan Harrington went missing there on November 20, 2012. She informed her roommate of her plans to that particular day as she was leaving her home. No one saw her again after that. The name of the guy she was meant to meet, Eric McFadden, was discovered by the police. He admitted during questioning that he was scheduled to meet with Sage, but that it never took place because he had other matters to take care of while the police were determining their next course of action. Alexis Murphy, 17, left her home in a truck close to Lynchburg, approximately a 30-minute drive away, while McFadden departed. She and her dad had made a deal that she had never broken the rule that she had to be home by midnight. The first time Alexis didn't arrive home by midnight was on August 3, 2013, and her grandmother instantly recognized a problem. The calls went to voicemail, so they were unable to speak with Alexis on the phone. Alexis was well-liked on social media and had many of friends. In an effort to locate Alexis, her parents contacted anyone who may have seen her on the day of her disappearance. This effort helped crack the case, attracted a lot of social media attention, and was featured in national news. People talked about the path Alex was scheduled to take via the notorious Route 29 from the shipment to Lynchburg, a movie theater in Charlottesville, Virginia, 40 miles from Alexis's house, and in the other direction from Lynchburg where she was headed, was where her white Nissan, which she usually traveled in, was discovered 3 days after she vanished. Although the area was cordoned off, forensic specialists could find no evidence of a crime in the car. One was made in the investigation. Surveillance footage from the Livingston Liberty gas station provided a breakthrough in the investigation. Detectives carefully reviewed the video, which was captured on Saturday, the day Alexis left her house for Lynchburg. A slim-built man who held the door open for Alexis as he entered the building caught their attention in particular. The cashier who worked that day admitted to the police that there had been a brief exchange between the man, and the cashier also clearly remembers a Daffy Duck tattoo on the man's neck and the fact that he was driving a camouflage SUV after Alexis had paid and left for her car. The man exited the petrol station first, and Alexis followed shortly after, according to further analysis of the video. However, given that she was traveling in the direction of Lynchburg, this might have been a coincidence. Another video clip of the same person was obtained by the police. It was taken by a camera at an adult business in Charlottesville 1 hour before he at the petrol station appeared. He bought a movie from the selection offered at those shops, but the key finding was that Randy Taylor was indeed the man who had made the purchase. On the night of her abduction, Samantha Clark had received a call from the same person. The whereabouts of Randy Taylor was promptly discovered by the police. Only 1.5 miles separated him from the gas station and his mobile home. A search warrant might be obtained thanks to video evidence showing Alexis Murphy and Randy Taylor interacting on the day of her disappearance. Anything that might be connected to Alexis's disappearance was taken by FBI officers. Inside the trailer, they discovered 3 items that were particularly noteworthy: black hair, a severed artificial nail, and an earring stud. In close proximity to Randy Taylor's porch, within 20 meters, they discovered a broken phone that was also taken in for inspection. Within 2 days, the outcomes showed that it was Alexis Murphy's phone. Analyses proved Randy Taylor's connection to the missing girl. The earring, nail, and hair that were discovered in his home belonged to Alexis. Alexis Murphy was still missing 11 days after she vanished, despite the fact that Randy Taylor had been taken into custody. When Taylor arrived at the courthouse, he was accused of kidnapping. Taylor began to speak when he recognized that the police were looking for information that would implicate him in both the kidnapping and the death of the missing young woman. However, his statement was now what everyone knew. He said that day Alexis was in his trailer as expected, but she wasn't there by herself. She was there with a black man named Damian Bradley who had dreadlocks. The authorities found evidence that Alexis and Damian Bradley had indeed interacted online and met in person. They visited Taylor's trailer, according to Taylor, to sell plants they were growing, and they had a beer. Taylor utilized a physical struggle between Alexis and her friend at some time to explain why Alexis's DNA was found in the police investigated Damian Bradley's alibi and discovered that he was in another state at the time. It seemed as though Taylor was merely attempting to place the responsibility elsewhere. In the meantime, FBI officers went back to the trailer for another push, and it worked. They discovered Taylor's t-shirt, which was worn the day Alexis vanished, and was now wrinkled below the couch. Eyelashes and hair extensions that are frequently used as extensions were wrapped within. After inspection, it was discovered that the eyelashes and hair were. These pieces of evidence were sufficient to accuse Randy Taylor of both the kidnapping and the murder of Alexis Murphy on May 8, 2014. Randy Taylor was given 2 consecutive life sentences in July after being found guilty on all counts. Taylor said he would divulge the whereabouts of Alexis's body if his 2 life sentences were lowered to 20 years in prison in response to Alexis's family, eliminating any remaining concerns regarding his role in the young woman's abduction. Declared that they would not engage in negotiations and would never give Taylor the chance to escape and hurt someone else. Before Alexis Murphy's family had any prospect of being able to say goodbye to her, nearly 6 hard years had gone. Human remains were found on private land on December 3, 2020, and on February 5, 2021, it was determined that the bones belonged to Alexis Murphy. Although Taylor was said to have disclosed the location of the remains, no agreements were made with him, and his sentence is still in place. It's important to note that Samantha Clark's case, who aired in 2010 and was tied to Taylor, was reclassified on January 15, 2021, and is now being handled as a homicide investigation. On September 13, 2014, Hannah Graham, an 18-year-old student, vanished from Charlottesville. She was last seen in the early hours of the morning at a mall. Extensive searches involving more than 1,000 volunteers were carried out a week after Hannah vanished, but she was not discovered. She was seen on surveillance video and the police found it. Jesse Matthew, 32, was recognized as the individual seen with Hannah in the video recordings. His flat was searched, but he wasn't taken into custody. He was named as a suspect in Hannah Graham's kidnapping 4 days after that. When a warrant was issued for Matthew's arrest, he had already left. The following day, he was captured in Galveston, Texas. He was thought to be planning to flee the nation and traveled to Mexico. On September 29, 2014, it was revealed that information gathered during Morgan Harrington's case linked Jesse Matthew to her death. Remains were discovered in Albemarle County on October 18, 2014. And they were eventually recognized as Hannah Graham's. Notably, these remains were located within 5 miles from the location of Morgan Harrington's remains. Matthew was charged with Hannah Graham's kidnapping on February 10, 2015, and on September 15 of that same year, he was also charged in connection with the Morgan Harrington case. However, it was later discovered that Hannah Graham and Morgan Harrington were after a month of study. A number of Jesse Matthew victims fled Liberty University in Lynchburg after one of the female students accused him of rape. He was able to avoid punishment nevertheless, since the complainant abandoned the allegations. After enrolling at Christopher Newport University in Newport News a few days later in January 2003, Matthew was once more the target of the same accusations. The victim again retracted the accusations after the university police looked into the issue. Matthew, from January 15 to October 15 of 2003, I attended Newport University. There were 2 missing ladies during this time. The fate of Without a Trace and their locations are still unknown. No evidence linking Matthew to their cases or the Cassandra Morton case was discovered, despite the police's investigation into any possible connections between their disappearances and Matthew. With this knowledge, there is only one question that can be asked. If the police had done their job properly, and both colleges where the complaints were made, at least 2 lives would have been saved if Matthew had persevered in the cases without worrying about damaging their image. In Charlottesville, Matthew started working as a cab driver in 2005. It's important to note that in the same year, a woman traveling home from work in Fairfax was attacked. In the Fairfax case, Jesse Matthew was charged with 3 counts of kidnapping, and the police were able to get a DNA sample from the culprit at the time, which has since been found to match Jesse Matthews' DNA. First off, he was found guilty on all 3 counts and given a life sentence for each one on October 2, 2015. In addition to the 3 life sentences he has previously been given as of this writing, in the instances of Alicia Reynolds and Morgan Harrington, he was sentenced to 4 further life terms for each of those crimes on March 2, 2016. The positions of Sage Smith, Carolyn McDaniel, Samantha Ann Clark, Laura Winans, and Julianne Williams are still available. It is challenging when you look at these faces. It is difficult to think what additional horrors they may have kept buried in their closets, and it is much more difficult to comprehend the suffering they have caused the victims' loved ones. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching. In the state of Nuevo León, specifically in Mexico, an 18-year-old young woman named Devani Escobar did not return home after going to a party on the evening of April 8, 2022. What happened to her has become the most discussed news in Mexico, and debates about what actually happened continue to this day. Devani Escobar, the only child of Dolores and Mario. Escobar was a student of law and criminology. Friday, April 8, 2022, at around 8 p.m., she went to the party with 2 friends, but she didn't return home. The next day, a big number of police officers and volunteers joined the hunt for her. On April 11th, Devani's parents, who were desperately trying to locate her, shared a picture on her social media site, which revealed the first anomalies and specifics of her absence. The image, which was taken from the side by an unidentified person, shows the body standing in the center of a motorway. It's unknown if she was aware that she was being photographed at the time. When his daughter did not come home on April 9th, her father received this image and put a caption saying that this was the final time anyone saw his daughter, according to Mario. Additionally, he noted that Damani's group companions safely made it back to their homes. They allegedly placed Damani in a cab and requested that the driver take her home. This picture was taken at the time by a taxi driver. It wasn't immediately obvious how or why this photo was shot, but in Mexico, where femicide is a widespread issue and statistics show that 10 women disappear on average every day, it went viral and sparked a massive outrage. Protests found new traction in the state of Nuevo León alone, where 52 women went missing in the first quarter of 2022. On April 13th, hundreds of worried citizens marched through the streets of Monterrey, carrying banners with pictures of the missing ladies, while the detectives working on the case started to piece together what had happened before Devani's disappearance. Their case was supported by the young women's friends' statements and video evidence from security cameras. In light of the fact that Bonnie only met the second young woman on the day of her disappearance, it is important to note that calling the 2 young women Bonnie attended the party with friends is a stretch. The police discovered video from a business located about 4 miles away. The tape taken at 11:30 p.m. shows the young woman standing next to the cashier, 5 kilometers from the residence of the deceased. They also bought plastic glasses, Coke, and a 750 milliliter bottle of vodka. The party waited near the store for almost an hour, during which time they used some of the things they had bought. They departed the business at 12:49 a.m. and took a taxi to Nuevo Castillo Bar, which was about 8 kilometers away. When they got there, they discovered the event they were going to have. They were advised that another party was nearby, albeit it had already concluded, so they chose to head there at 1:30 a.m. Even though they were unknown at the private property party, the young women begged permission to enter. 2 hours and 15 minutes after they were given permission to enter, the body can be seen attempting to flee from a man on surveillance footage provided by the police, but he catches up with her and stops her. When other people arrive, Bonnie tries to kick the man again but misses. The argument appears to have been settled. When partygoers were questioned by the police, they said that the argument started because the body was very inebriated. She had earlier purchased a bottle of vodka, which some people tried to seize, but she wouldn't give it up and insulted them. It's crucial to remember that this account of what happened was given to Bonnie's friends, who decided to send her home by partygoers. They recorded the phone number of the cab driver who had taken them there, and at 3:54 a.m., she called him to request a ride to take the Bonnie home. When the taxi arrived at the spot, Devani climbed into the back seat alone, leaving her pals behind. They approached Cigar and spoke with the driver there. The interior of the automobile is illuminated in the following recording, which was made only 20 minutes later and 100 meters from where Devana boarded the taxi. The Bonnie appeared to be fighting with the driver, while already seated in the front seat. She was found to be unwilling to depart, and the taxi. The cabbie tried to phone her friend for assistance, but he was ignored. He sent her a WhatsApp message warning her that she was acting aggressively and refusing to leave at 4:25 a.m., and that he didn't know Devani's specific address. The taxi driver let Devani's companion know that she got out of the vehicle. He snapped a photo, the same one that depicts Bonnie standing in the middle of the road, as proof. The taxi driver pleaded with Bonnie's companion to visit or call the girl's parents frequently, but she refused. Devani's buddy ignored the taxi driver's request to gather because there was only 400 meters between where she got into the car and where the picture was taken. The cab driver made several futile attempts to contact your pal before being forced to leave. But before he left, he sent her a message explaining that he couldn't force Devaney back into the car since he didn't want any issue or charges of kidnapping or other such behavior. After Devaney vanished and this picture was released, rumors started to circulate. The young woman had gotten out of the cab because the driver was harassing her, he claimed. The taxi driver was questioned by the authorities numerous times. He searched his car and phone, but could find no evidence linking him to the young woman's abduction. The taxi driver left the young woman and fled, according to video that the police were able to retrieve from a transportation company's security camera. Devani was seen in the video standing in front of a camera that was pointed at the road. About 50 meters from the camera, a woman can be seen standing on the road for a while. It's hard to say if she was conscious of what she was doing at the time. But shortly Bonnie begins to approach the camera. There doesn't seem to be anyone pursuing her when she arrives at it at 4:30, as shown by the timestamp, knowing where Bonnie was last seen. The region where she was last seen was the focus of the search. Police reports state that Bonnie didn't step foot on the transportation company's property. A motel around 150 meters away from the transportation provider also had security cameras put there. However, as law enforcement officials noted, no recordings were created from these cameras because they were solely used for real-time observation of the location. Police and volunteers meticulously investigated the area of the transportation company, the motel, all nearby streets, and vacant lots, but no signs of the body were discovered. 100,000 pesos, or around $5,000 US, was offered as a reward. Was made in exchange for any details that would help with the investigation. Bonnie's body was discovered on the grounds of the motel, only 100 meters from where she had been last seen, 1 week after she vanished and after 12 days of assiduous searching by family volunteers and law enforcement. It is important to note that despite several searches by the authorities in the motel vicinity, the body was still missing on April 21st, when the motel personnel noticed a pungent odor coming from an abandoned building. They themselves alerted the police. From an underground tank where the body was later found. Let's examine the motel and its surroundings in more detail so that you can determine which tank is being discussed. There is a round building. These are the motel's primary structures, including the restaurant, which has been closed for a number of years, and the pool, which has not been used in a long time. There is only one entry from the road, and the entire area is cordoned off with barbed wire. The subterranean tank where Devani's body was is here, close to the wall. A lid covers the first tank, which has 2 openings that were both open, and the body was removed from the second tank, which has 2 entrances that were both open. The tank has a depth of 4 meters, 43 centimeters from top to bottom, and it is divided into 2 portions by a 20-centimeter partition within. At the time the body was found, the water level in the tank was 90 centimeters deep in both portions. It's also vital to remember that the interior barrier of the tank is not completely solid. The right and left sides of the tank are connected by a 23-centimeter wide channel. We shall come back to this point in a moment. Even more oddities started to show up as soon as Devani's body was found. The young woman's body was recovered from the water, but experts determined that the cause of death was a cranial brain damage in the forehead region, which might have been brought on by a fall into the cistern. The police quickly come to the conclusion that the occurrence was an accident. It was also found that the death occurred between 5 days and 2 weeks ago. Nevertheless, the father of the deceased did not accept the accident explanation and was perplexed as to why the police, who had searched the motel area numerous times, had not discovered the body of his daughter earlier. The Attorney General's Office of Nuevo Leon removed the special prosecutor in charge of missing person cases in response to these accusations, claiming carelessness and mistakes in the investigation. However, the prosecutor was present before dismissed recordings from 2 other security cameras, one at the motel reception and the other inside the vacant restaurant, also came to light. The police had previously asserted that the motel cameras only functioned in real time and did not record any images. We'll look at these recordings after I remind you that it was 4:30 when Devani was found on the road. The motel property was 150 meters away from the restaurant's entrance. Devani walked peacefully toward the transport firm, and no one was chasing after her. However, she stormed into the motel's grounds 5 minutes later, as if someone were after her. Devani was seen jogging alongside the restaurant by the camera that was placed across from the entrance. No one can be seen chasing her in the section of the film that the authorities released. Therefore, it can be assumed that something happened when she arrived at the gate to the transportation company. Anything compelled her to flee. The second recording is for my restaurant camera. We must first comprehend the area that this camera can catch before we can comprehend the locations where the body is visible in the video. Consequently, the door leading to the road is located in the upper right corner, and this glass door leads to the inner courtyard. You can only get to it by traveling around the restaurant at 4:35 and 31 seconds without climbing over the barbed wire gate. Bonnie may be seen rushing toward the entrance to the She fled inside the motel grounds on the footage at 4:36 after running to the street, as we've observed before. Bonnie moves closer to the glass door and peers inside before moving on to the spot where the fence edge meets the restaurant structure. She seemed to have spent the last 20 minutes cowering in a corner, concealing. Throughout those 20 minutes, nobody approached her. At 4:56, Bonnie comes around the corner and proceeds along the fence, eventually arriving at those cisterns. The official accounts of what happened state that the body stumbled and smacked her head when she lost consciousness of the open cistern in the shadows. The injury was in the area of the forehead, as was already indicated. If the young lady did really fall down by mistake, it is more likely that she did so after hitting her head. She would have leaned forward out of inertia had she taken a step without feeling the earth beneath her. The officials released an accelerated recording that lasted more than an hour to prove that nobody else was visible in this camera's field of vision. Upon careful observation at hour F4:56, the body emerged from the corner and proceeded along the fences. At 5:44, 30 seconds later, a shadow flickered on the door. At 5:47, 11 seconds, a car stopped opposite the door leading to the street. 12 seconds later, a silhouette of a person appeared next to that door. At 5:47, 44 seconds later, the car left. At 6:12, 14 seconds later, another shadow flickered on the door leading to the inner courtyard. To ascertain if someone was pursuing the recording, all available recordings are included below. Bonnie. According to the prosecutor's account, the police withheld the recordings from the video camera at the motel reception, which would require examination. Since Bonnie couldn't see the open cistern lids in the darkness, she fell and suffered a serious head injury that finally caused her death. Damani would have encountered 3 cisterns on her way to the cisterns. The first one would have been closed, followed by 2 open lids, but her body wasn't discovered there. The third one, but considering the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the body in the second, there were whispers going around that the young woman had been murdered before being put into the cistern. The authorities made evidence that suggested Damani was alive after falling into the cistern public in order to disprove these rumors. Her shoes and a scrap of cloth were also found there, along with her body, which was recovered in the left portion of the cistern. Furthermore, the wall that separates needs to be highlighted, dividing the cistern in half. Its width is 20 centimeters, and its height is 2 meters and 13 centimeters. The body's pocketbook, her face mask, and a white bra were discovered on top of the barrier. It is vital to realize that the only way to place anything on this barrier is to stoop down into the cistern. Since there is no way to go down or up inside the cistern, nothing can be placed on the barrier from the outside. The fact that Bonnie placed the items suggests that she was alive for a while, according to the officials. It is unclear whether Bonnie could have placed her belongings on the 2-meter, 13-centimeter high partition or if she threw them there. This suggests that Devani herself threw the items on the partition, a lighter and a set of 3 keys. Unfortunately, information regarding Bonnie's height could not be found. The appropriate area of the cistern contained both her phone and pocketbook. Although we can only guess as to what exactly transpired, if the body did fall and strike her in the head, she would have been bewildered, particularly given that it was dark. The barrier may have opened when she opted to toss her purse on it, allowing some of the contents to fall and land in the second half of the cistern. Devani's bra situation that evening is likewise unknown, as is whether or not it was in her purse. It's also not clear if she had a bra on that particular evening, or if it was in her handbag. It's also crucial to remember that she was dressed when her body was discovered. On one of the TV shows, the person's friends who she went to the party with said that she was intoxicated and that some people tried to take advantage of her, decided to send her home by calling a taxi. Right now, everything evidence points to the case being concluded and the death being classified as an accident. Damani's father disagrees with this account, and he thinks that someone was involved in his daughter's passing. The parents performed an independent examination after receiving the body, but the findings have not been made public. Mario Escobar claims that his future course of action depends on whether or not the authorities decide to keep looking into Bonnie's death or rule it out as an accident. What are your thoughts on this incident? Do you think it was a terrible accident or a criminal act? Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching. An 18-year-old woman went to another city in her car before going missing. The young woman vanished without a trace, and a week later, her body was discovered in a river. The police had no suspects, and her car wasn't located for years. It wasn't until 14 years later that the young woman's family discovered the horrific reality. The small American hamlet of Covington, Tennessee, is where Lisa Kimmel was born on July 18, 1969. Her parents soon welcomed 2 more children, and in 1972, the family relocated to Billings. The girl stood out from a young age for her. She worked part-time at a nearby restaurant and assisted her parents in caring for their younger sisters, demonstrating independence and tenacity. Because of this, she acquired a brand new Honda CRX before high school graduation. Little Miss, as she was frequently referred to by her parents and sisters, was added to the young woman's license plate, and this plate would play an important part in the overall plot. Despite the opposition of her parents, Lisa chose to continue working at the restaurant after graduating from high school in 1987. The young woman planned to pursue a profession in her chosen field against her parents' concerns. They wanted their daughter to attend college. They ultimately decided Lisa would work for a year and still think about attending college. Soon after graduating, Lisa was presented with a management post, but she was already in another city. The young woman worked at a huge chain restaurant called Arby's alongside her mother, who was the regional manager there. She was expected to relocate to the Denver suburbs, nearly 900 kilometers away from her home, and run a restaurant there. It was a significant assignment for the 18-year-old, who had just graduated from high school, but Lisa embraced it without hesitation. Her mother also visited Denver frequently for work, and they saw each other virtually weekly. The young woman occasionally drove herself to her family's home in Billings. Lisa worked at a restaurant in the city of Aurora. She moved in promptly, rented an apartment, and was generally enthusiastic about her new situation. She met several new friends. She started dating Ed a few months later. He lived 800 miles distant yet frequently traveled to Aurora. On March 25, 1988, a Friday, Lisa was getting ready eagerly for the weekend. For the weekend, she had numerous plans. To finally reveal her boyfriend to her family, she planned to travel to Billings with him. He resided in Cody, Wyoming, close to where she was traveling. Lisa had intended to pick him up and accompany him on their journey. At around 4 o'clock, she left Aurora. After traveling roughly 400 kilometers, she had about 7 hours to drive to the boyfriend's place. Lisa reached Douglas, Wyoming. Apparently, she was rushing since at 9 o'clock at night, a police officer pulled her car up for speeding based on his radar readings. When the police issued Lisa a $120 fine, she was traveling at a speed of roughly 140 kilometers per h. According to state law, she was supposed to pay the money to the officer immediately. The policeman advised Lisa to use the closest ATM close to the road to get the money, since she didn't have that much on her. When they arrived, the terminal did not accept Lisa's credit card. The culprit, who was unable to pay the fee, was detained by the police officer. However, he released Lisa on the condition that she mail the check to the neighborhood police station. It took the young woman roughly 4 hours to get from Douglas to her boyfriend's residence by automobile. She didn't wait for her that evening, and by the time Ed got up at around 7 a.m., he had fallen asleep. Lisa was still missing at the time. He had no means to reach her because there were no cell phones. Instead, he began making calls to the 2 states' police departments. Inquiring as to whether anything had transpired, he provided information regarding Lisa and her vehicle. Despite accepting the information, the police decided not to open a case of a missing person. This was due to Lisa's age, 18, and the fact that too little time had gone since her disappearance. After a few more hours, he continued contacting their mutual friends, but none of them picked up. They were aware of her disappearance. He then attempted to reach Lisa's parents, but they weren't at home. He also contacted Lisa's boss. When they returned hours later, their phone was ringing nonstop. To find out if they had heard from their daughter, other persons made simultaneous attempts to contact them. The parents initially believed Lisa had simply been delayed and was still traveling. It was difficult to believe that anything could have occurred to her, given that she had previously taken this path numerous times. However, time went by and she was still missing. By that time, her parents had called Ed and invited him to visit them. In such disturbing circumstances, Lisa's long-planned first encounter took place without her, and 2 days later, the young woman was still unreachable. The law mandated a 72-hour waiting period before reporting a missing individual. The parents made the decision to begin their own search rather than wait impassively. A small aircraft pilot was contracted by Lisa's father to fly over the area where the young woman was. He hoped this would assist him find where her automobile was supposed to be, but the search was fruitless. Along some of that road, the father also drove his car, but he was unable to spot Lisa. The family continued on after that. The girl's parents called a friend of theirs who was a private investigator and had previously worked for the police. He was able to persuade the neighborhood police agency to accept an early missing person complaint because of his contacts. Sadly, they found no leads, so the police were called right away. Although it was discovered that Lisa had been stopped by their patrol officer the night she vanished, her whereabouts were still unclear. There was just one thing that was certain. Between Douglas and the town of Cody, the young woman in the car had vanished. The area along that path had been searched by the authorities, but there is one major issue. There are hundreds of miles worth of farmland, woods, and mountains involved. To cover the entire area, it required months of labor and thousands of workers. The search on the ground therefore made little or no progress. On the morning of April 2nd, 8 days had gone when a guy dialed the police. He claimed to be river fishing close to Casper, Wyoming. He once recognized the body that was submerged face down in the river. The fisherman immediately assumed it was her since he had just heard on the radio that the police were seeking for a missing young woman. When detectives arrived on the scene, they pulled the body from the water and confirmed that Lisa was indeed the decedent. Medical professionals examined the body and made a dreadful discovery. Lisa passed away just 2 days prior to her body being found, so investigators had to figure out where she had been hiding out for the entire time. It was later confirmed that the young woman passed away about 6 days after going missing. The death was initially believed by the authorities to have happened roughly 5 hours after she vanished, which later caused misunderstanding. Doctors also found multiple stab wounds and contusions on the young woman's body, concluding that she had been abused while still alive. It appears that she had been thrown into the sea from a bridge while she was still aware. Later, when blood was discovered on the bridge, police corroborated this claim, Medical professionals eventually removed biological material from the victim's body, which was discovered to be a sample of male sperm that appeared to belong to the murderer. It was submitted to a lab, but at the time, DNA analysis technologies were quite limited, and the neighborhood lab lacked the tools essential to recover the offender's profile. Detectives came to the conclusion that the murderer was probably a local person who lived close to the river because of the young woman had been thrown from a bridge that was in a wilderness location that was far away, had been abandoned for a while, and required turning off the main road into a country road in order to access. Because of this, the police reasoned that only someone who was familiar with the area could have picked this bridge as a place to dump bodies. The detectives concentrated on finding Lisa's automobile because they thought the murderer had drove it somewhere and that it would contain more clues, but the car was never found. They were unable to locate it since it appeared to have dropped into the ground. In the hopes that someone would have useful information, investigators extensively disseminated information about the case to the general public. A lot of people came forward when the case was widely covered on television, and an odd thing started to happen. The police received over 100 calls in total. People claimed to have spotted Lisa in a Honda CRX with Little Miss license plates. Only these witnesses were from various states, and occasionally even from Canada. The cops believed that appeals were more persuasive. Several days following Lisa's abduction on March 26 and 27, 5 different witnesses asserted to having seen the same car with the license plate, Little Miss being driven by a young woman who remarkably resembled Lisa. The young woman had to go to work on Monday, and she would never have missed it, so it's difficult to believe that she stayed in the Casper region for a few days for whatever reason, and didn't feel the need to call her family.
One eyewitness reported seeing a male. Despite making many inquiries, the police were unable to verify that the man was actually seated in the car with Lisa. 7 photographs of the claimed individuals seen with Lisa were compiled by the investigators, but none of them were useful for the inquiry because the descriptions were too varied to single out any one man. The statements of each witness were investigated by the police. They acknowledged that the murderer may have been behind the wheel of Lisa's automobile, but they could find no logical explanation for how Lisa could have spent the weekend driving about without phoning the perpetrator. Apparently, one of the witnesses saw the killer actually drive Lisa's car to hide it, while the rest of the testimony is either incorrect or outright fraudulent. Parents can call 911 from any nearby payphone. Falls police later discovered that numerous similar automobile types were registered nearby, and it's possible that witnesses saw them while the investigation was going on. Numerous suspects were named by the detectives, but it was later discovered that none of them were connected to the case. Police received a new information 6 months later. Someone had pinned an envelope to Lisa's clothing, a grave with a letter on a man's behalf. It was stated that he regretted Lisa's passing and described it as a devastating loss. Stringfellow Hawk, a figure from a well-known TV show at the time, signed the letter. The note didn't initially appear to be odd, but every member of Lisa's family and circle of friends immediately denied any involvement. In March 1989, exactly 1 year after Lisa's passing, the police consequently reasoned that it might have been left by the killer. Disappearance information about the case was presented on a well-known television program about unsolved crimes. The police received numerous tip-off calls due to the fact that it was watched by millions of people across the nation. Detectives from the area had to put in extra time and manpower to confirm them. The volume of tips and leads that the neighborhood police station received after the episode aired, in the opinion of Lisa's parents, was too much for them to handle. They wanted the FBI to investigate the death of their daughter for this reason, but Sheriff Ron Ketchum was very opposed to the concept and declared that he had no plans to abandon the lawsuit. Nevertheless, a year later, with the backing of higher authorities, Lisa's parents were still able to enlist federal detectives in the case. They got involved in the inquiry and sought to collaborate with the sheriff, but he refused to do so or even answer their calls. The investigators were now able to examine a DNA sample from the victim's body at a federal lab because of the FBI's participation. The sample was matched to that of Lisa's boyfriend, and they didn't match. The detectives decided to be absolutely certain, even though he had never been considered a suspect before. They then made the decision to investigate the patrolman who had stopped Lisa just before she vanished. Although detectives acknowledged that he might have filed Lisa and attacked her later, he possessed a recording of a discussion with the young woman that showed him bidding her farewell. The cop gave his DNA sample right away, and it did not match that of the murderers. After a local radio station broadcast a show about Lisa's murder, the next unexpected tip was received. Were called by a witness who claimed that he had witnessed Sheriff Ron Ketchum stopping the young woman in the road on the day she vanished, and there were some pretty suspicious moments at play. The sheriff opposed the FBI's involvement in the investigation and never claimed to have stopped Lisa that evening. Then, exactly 2 years after Lisa's death, a guy abruptly left the police and made an attempt on his own life. When detectives questioned him, he was able to recover and was receiving psychological treatment. Ron, however, entered a not guilty plea and declined to give a DNA sample. The investigators started to take him seriously as a suspect because everything about him seemed suspicious. But when they were prepared to get a court order for a DNA sample a few months later, the man did offer one himself, and it did not match the killer sample. It's unclear why, if he was unrelated to Lisa's death, the sheriff was behaving in such a peculiar manner. His co-workers noted that he had always been a complex individual who had experienced Vietnam, thus before the young woman vanished, he was acting in this manner. The cops eventually ran out of solid leads. They published more information about the case in 1992 in the hopes of locating other witnesses. The primary account of the inquiry suggests that there may have been many offenders. Most likely, one man abducted and killed Lisa, but someone else assisted in getting rid of the car. The possibility of the young woman being abducted at a traffic stop at a petrol station or someplace else was also considered by the investigators, but it was ruled out. Prior to these occurrences, the young woman was very cautious, and Lisa picked her up after his car stalled on the road and another driver stopped to assist her. Because she was aware of the potential danger, the young woman did not step out of the car and merely slightly dropped her window to speak with him. The case remained unsolved for an additional 10 years because the authorities were unable to pursue any fresh leads. They didn't experience their long-awaited breakthrough until July 2002. The neighborhood's police force reopened the killer's DNA sample was the first thing entered into the FBI database during the inquiry. It wasn't used en masse across the nation until the late 1980s, and even then, it wasn't around yet. When they finally added a sample from Lisa's body, detectives discovered a match right away. The sample belonged to Dale Wayne Eaton, 59, who was incarcerated at the time. In 1997, he had been detained for using a weapon against a young couple and their young child when they were traveling through Wyoming. Wilderness. Dale drove by and stopped to assist as their car stalled. We offered the family a ride to the closest service station, which allegedly belonged to his brother, after he examined the car and indicated there was no way to fix it immediately. After agreeing, they boarded his van. Dale declared he was exhausted and needed to sleep a short distance later. He climbed into the rear of the vehicle and asked the woman to take the wheel. He grabbed his rifle and motioned for the woman to get out of the car and onto a country road as soon as it moved. Woman violently twisted the wheel, knocking Dale off balance and causing him to drop his weapon. When they exited the vehicle, the assailant reached for a knife, but the family's father quickly reached for the rifle and struck Dale with the buttstock. After that, the family climbed into his van and headed to the neighborhood police station. Dale was apprehended by detectives after they drove to the spot and found him nearby. Due to the numerous mental impairments that were discovered during his trial, they decided to put him to a closed rehabilitation center rather than imprison him. According to the authorities, he would stay there for a number of years during which he would receive assistance in moving on with his life, finding a job, and other things. After a few months, he managed to escape, for which reason he was apprehended and given a 5-year prison sentence. What matters most in this situation is that Dale's DNA was collected before he was imprisoned and submitted into the FBI database. This led to the Lisa case's investigators ultimately finding a match. He lived nearby and was 43 years old when Lisa was killed. Law enforcement investigated Dale's past in that area and found a long list of crimes he had committed. At the age of 16, he committed his first significant crime. Dale offered to help the woman take the watermelons he had just sold her home. The woman looked at the watermelons after they arrived and noticed they were rotten. After a lengthy altercation in which she refused to pay for them, Dale stabbed her and then ran away. The following day, the man was taken into custody, and the court ordered him to receive treatment. He was identified as having many moderate mental illnesses. Following treatment, he kept switching employment since he couldn't establish himself in any position. He eventually got married, and the two went on to have 3 kids. The couple's 15-year marriage was miserable. They fought frequently and separated. He relocated to Moneta, a city only an hour's drive from Casper, in 1996. There, his in-laws had a bus converted into dwelling and numerous unfinished constructions on the property. Dale made himself at home there. Except for an occasional tiny bed, there were no living quarters in that bus. To take a shower, he would travel to a neighbor's home. Because of this, Lisa's body had DNA from a seasoned serial offender, but authorities weren't ready to arrest him because they needed more proof. Officers showed up to the precinct where he formerly resided. Nearby, a number of neighbors lived, and one of them gave the detectives an intriguing tale. Around the time Lisa vanished, Dale allegedly dug a sizable hole on his property and declared he was going to put, but that never happened, in a septic tank. When the lot was dug up, the detectives discovered Lisa's automobile with Little Miss license plates. With all of this information in hand, the police began to work gathering the evidence they would need to successfully prosecute Dale. They knew they would have plenty of time while he was inside because Dale killed the man who shared his cell with him. He was finally charged with Lisa Kimmel's murder in April 2003. The lawsuit proceeded because the man refused to admit guilt. The prosecution called Dale's other cellmate to testify, saying that the man confessed to him about Lisa's murder and gave him all the details the young woman allegedly saw him on the side of the road, stopped, and agreed to give him a ride. At one point, Dale allegedly started to molest her but was rejected. Then he pulled a gun and ordered her to his house where Lisa was killed. But nobody accepted this explanation. Lisa's parents warned her against picking up a hitchhiker in the middle of the night in a remote location. Dale had a motive to lie. Either he told his cellmate a lie, or he made it up himself to get his sentence reduced for testifying. The investigation reveals that was not the case. Lisa most likely stopped at a petrol station before Dale attacked her there. Between Casper and Dale's house, they even mentioned a certain gas station by name. Lisa had to pass it on her way there. Cody Dale probably got into her car and used a revolver to compel her to drive to some isolated spot because he frequently drove there to use the public lavatory. Then, he brought her back to his station and held her in the bus because he had no water on the site. He took her to that bridge a few days later, stabbed her multiple times, and then threw her into the sea after deciding to get rid of her. Additionally, experts compared Dale's handwriting to that of the note placed on Lisa's grave. They discovered a lot of similarities, but despite the difficulty of calling it evidence in court, Dale was found guilty thanks to DNA evidence found on the body and the car that were both on his property. Even the lawyers were aware of this and made an effort to have their client not receive the death penalty rather than an entire acquittal. They cited the mental disorders that prevented him from accepting full accountability for his deeds, but in vain. Dale was given the death penalty when the jury found him guilty. Then Lisa's parents sued him in a civil case, which was approved by the young woman's parents, along with the fire department, destroyed all of the buildings on the land where they were located, after the court ordered that Dale be removed from it. Since Lisa's conviction, this occurred on her birthday. In 2010, the court accepted the appeal and scheduled a fresh hearing despite Dale's attorney's repeated attempts to have the death penalty revoked. The appeal was approved on the grounds that the court erred in imposing the penalty. In addition, the evidence of Dale's cellmate was seized upon by the defense team to take into account the offender's significant childhood mental disorders and developmental deficiencies. Although the man's testimony may have been made up and the jury was not informed that he had been promised a lighter sentence as a result, there is still little chance of the sentence being completely overturned. The death penalty is unlikely because Dale is still incarcerated and is currently 78 years old. In this entire narrative, there is one more point worth highlighting. In the neighborhood where Dale lived, there have been a number of unsolved homicides and mysterious disappearances of young women. Despite the lack of available proof, the police acknowledge that Dale could have been the murderer. His entire life shows a definite propensity towards crimes in Syria. This suggests that Lisa Kimmel wasn't his only victim. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching.
Almost immediately, a first-year college student was discovered dead in her own bedroom. Any one of the police's numerous suspects could have been the murderer. The subsequent breakthrough was akin to a detective story with unexpected turns and a long-awaited revelation made possible by a small DNA sample. We'll explain what happened to Jennifer Halen in this video. Welcome to A to Z Crime Stories. Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. On February 23, 1988, Jennifer Allen was born in Wimberley, Texas, a tiny hamlet in the United States. She grew up carefree and content with adoring parents, a sister named Diana, and loving parents. Her family soon relocated to Bryan, a city located about 200 kilometers away from her village. The young lady enrolled in Blinn College in her hometown after graduating from high school, with the intention of studying to become a legal assistant and hoping to make a connection with jurisprudence in her later years. She was well-liked, dependable, and friendly by a large number of her friends. She always had a positive outlook on things and was excited about her future career. Jenna moved into an apartment at Autumn Woods Apartments close to her college. She also took a job as a waitress in a nearby restaurant to help pay for housing costs and avoid being financially dependent on her parents, in spite of his busy schedule juggling work and school. Spencer Hood, Jenna's boyfriend, and her were frequently together. Even after Jenna moved into a rented apartment, they continued to live apart despite having been in a relationship since high school. Despite occasional disagreements, the couple's relationship had lasted for a while. Jenna, who was 20 years old at the time, finished her shift on April 8, 2008, and Spencer said goodbye to Jenna and went home for about 30 minutes at around 9 p.m. because he had finished studying with her at around midnight. Then they had a brief phone conversation before saying goodnight to one another and retiring to bed. On the morning of April 9th, Spencer realized that he had left his textbook, which he needed for a lecture, at Jenna's house. When no one came to the door, he went to her house to get it. The fact that it was unlocked shocked Spencer. He entered Jenna's apartment, assuming she was still asleep, and went to her bedroom, only to be confronted by a horrifying sight. Jenna was aware that she was dead as she lay lifeless on the ground. Spencer sprinted over to the adjacent apartment and pleaded with the occupants to call the police. This call's recording is accessible to everyone. The operator was informed by Jenna's neighbor that she was lying on the floor, not breathing, and in the distance, Spencer's startled voice could be heard. When the police arrived, they checked the apartment and discovered no evidence of the 4th century. The second bedroom's window being open was the only peculiarity. Detectives assumed right away that the killer might have entered the building through it, but this theory was challenged because the door was unlocked. The theory of a potential robbery, which might have prompted the perpetrator to attack Jenna because all of her belongings were in their proper places, was immediately challenged by investigators. Nothing of value was missing, and her purse containing cash and credit cards was hanging right by the front door, which a thief would have undoubtedly taken. Additionally, the apartment was in perfect order. There were no visible signs of a struggle. There was no indication that the murderer had been there recently, and when the police examined Jenna's body, they found no signs of serious injuries aside from a bruise on her forehead and a bit of lip. She was lying on her back. She had small bloodstains on the carpet next to her body and on the collar of her shirt. Medical professionals examined the body and came to several significant conclusions. First, Jenna passed away just an hour after she finished speaking with Spencer on the phone, about 10 hours before Spencer found her. Second, the cause of death, strangulation, was discovered on her body. The experts also concluded that the unidentified offender did not sexually assault the young woman, but that Jenna attempted to repel him, as shown by her fingernails had skin and blood under them. All of these samples were right away delivered to the lab in an effort to collect a DNA sample from the offender. Spencer, her boyfriend, was naturally the first person to be suspected for a number of reasons. First, according to statistics, murderers frequently end up being people close to the victim. Second, the lack of any indications of a forced entry suggested that Jenna might have known the offender and knowingly permitted them entry. Spencer cooperated with the investigation during questioning and responded to all. The police could not confirm Spencer's involvement in the murder at the time, because experts had not yet been able to obtain the killer's DNA sample. He was eventually set free, but the police took their time in clearing him of all charges. Jenna's friends, meanwhile, claimed that he loved her dearly and wasn't likely to have harmed his beloved. Detectives then started looking for potential witnesses. In order to determine whether Jenna's neighbors had observed anything, the police questioned them. They quickly located several men who were playing volleyball close to Jenna's apartment building on the night of the murder. They claimed to have seen a strange man at that time emerge from a building close to the young woman's apartment. The fact that this person was only sporting pants caught them off guard. The man appeared to be 26 years old, the witnesses continued. After learning about Jenna's friends, Sean Stevens, who also resided in the same apartment building, told the police about another concerning development in the past. Stevens, a real person, he yelled at Jenna from his window, directly across from her. Although the reason for this behavior was not entirely clear, the police had enough reason to suspect the young man Stevens based on all of these facts. He denied knowing anything about the murder and said he never left his apartment building at night, much less went outside in the open. Without any solid evidence, the police were unable to verify his claims, so they had to release him as well. Along with everything else, the detective looked at the potential. Although Jenna's restaurant co-workers and the surveillance cameras supported the theory that the murder was related to Jenna's place of employment, they also revealed that on the day of her death, she had no conflicts with anyone and that similar circumstances had never occurred before. The investigation slowed down after this. The police kept looking for new leads and questioned Jenna's family and friends. Eventually, they were able to get a new lead while speaking with the detectives. Parents of the young woman were able to recall crucial details from 2 months prior to Jenna's murder that might implicate another suspect. She complained about a repairman performing maintenance on her apartment complex building to her family. One day, she found a stranger in her living room after exiting the shower wearing only a towel. He responded that he believed no one was home when she asked him what he was doing in her apartment. The man stayed to assess the state of the shower and claimed not to have heard it run. Naturally, inspect your apartment to make sure nothing needs fixing. Jenna was astounded by the circumstance. She identified the man as Jeremiah Rosser, 29, and informed the building manager of the incident. The police carried out a small test. While the other person turned off the shower, one person stood at the front door. In the living room, and even close to the entrance door, one could clearly hear the sound of running water. It was highly unlikely that Rosser missed it and assumed nobody was home in such a scenario. The reason for Rosser's termination was discovered by the police after speaking with the building manager. He stopped showing up for work a few days after Jenna's murder. The detectives searched for the man because everything seemed very suspicious, but they ran into a problem. Rosser left his apartment, and they were unable to find him anywhere else. He only has a former wife and 2 kids, according to what the police were able to learn. Consequently, there were 3 main suspects in this intricate case. Sean Spencer, Hood Stevens, and Jeremiah Rosser had to wait for the results from the lab where specialists were attempting to extract the DNA sample in order to ascertain which of them was the murderer. They were analyzing the blood on the young woman's shirt and rug, as well as the particles under her nails. They discovered that one of the blood drops on the rug contained genetic material that did not belong to Jenna. As a result, the experts were finally able to use this sample, which matched the one taken from the particles under the young woman's nails. The first step in extracting a complete DNA sample was to enter it into the FBI database, but there were no matches. This indicated that the murderer had never before been found guilty of a serious crime. Nevertheless, the obtained sample could now be compared to DNA samples from the 3 main suspects by the police. Their samples not being collected during the initial interrogations was the only issue. When the detectives attempted to get in touch with them, they were shocked to learn that all 3 had left the area and that their whereabouts were unknown. Investigators made the decision to use the killer's DNA sample rather than just standing by and waiting for the police to start looking for them. Men who lived in the same complex as Jenna and worked in a restaurant started voluntarily providing DNA samples. They were able to collect 50 DNA samples in total, but none of them matched the sample taken from the crime scene. Spencer was eventually located by the police, who discovered that he was staying with his parents 3 hours away from Brian. The youth gave an explanation of his couldn't deal with Jenna's passing and made the decision to spend time with his family in order to forget about the tragedy. His DNA sample, which he voluntarily provided, was immediately sent to the lab. The young man also gave permission for experts to check his body for scratches that were undoubtedly made by the murderer after all of his skin fragments were discovered beneath Jenna's nails. After that, the police were able to find Stephen's location. He also traveled 720 kilometers to see his parents, who lived near Blinn College. He voluntarily provided a sample of his DNA, which was also sent to the lab. Finding the final suspect proved to be much more challenging, and it had to be done while the police awaited the laboratory's findings. When Rosser and his ex-wife were on the verge of divorcing, the police were able to get in touch with her, and she provided them with some unsettling information. Rosser was acting aggressively toward her. He extended his hand, knocked her to the ground, and attempted to choke her. He frequently caused scandals as well, which made it impossible to coexist with him. His union with his wife was annulled. Around the same time that Jenna was killed, all of this occurred. The police were able to find Rosser because of his ex-wife. Early October, 7 months after the murder, saw this occur. He answered all of the detectives' questions while behaving quite calmly during the interrogation. The man also denied involvement in the killing and voluntarily gave a DNA sample, never having been detained in his life. His car was also searched by the police, who made some intriguing finds. A few months prior to Jenna's murder, a laptop with a serial number that was listed in the theft report was discovered in the car. The worst part was that the police also discovered keys to several apartments in the residential complex where he worked, despite the fact that he was fired a week after Jenna's murder. Her neighbor had called the police after her laptop vanished from her apartment, but that wasn't the worst part. The manager was required to seize the keys because Rosser had no right to keep them. This all pointed to the fact that the man was petty theft, but could he advance to cold-blooded killing? In the meantime, all 3 DNA samples were examined by laboratory specialists. Rosser's DNA sample matched the sample discovered under the victim's nails, even though it later turned out that Jenna's boyfriend and her neighbor had nothing to do with the murder. The police detained Rosser right away after learning the results, but despite the DNA match, he insisted on his innocence. Naturally, this was of no assistance to him, and the man was accused of killing Jenna. Rosser was reluctant to give the details of that evening, so the investigators made up their own version of what took place. Rosser apparently broke into Jenna's apartment with the intent to use a key to her door to commit robbery. When the young lady had not yet arrived home from work in the evening before 9 p.m., this could have occurred. Rosser may not have had enough time to complete the intended crime because Jenna and her boyfriend arrived home, forcing the criminal to hide in the second bedroom and wait for Spencer to arrive. It's possible that Rosser opened the window in an effort to sneak out of the apartment without being seen, but that plan did not pan out. Rosser could finally try to leave the apartment through the front door after watching for Spencer to depart and hearing Jenna bid him goodnight on the phone. There are two explanations for what might have happened next. Either he attempted to leave the apartment, but Jenna saw him first, causing him to become panicked and attack her, or he went to her room on purpose with the intention of killing her. Even asserted that the young lady was the victim of his murder because she resembled his ex-wife. The man was prosecuted in court because he refused to accept responsibility for his actions. As is frequently the case in the state's legal system, the process for starting the trial dragged on for several months. But in December 2009, 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to start, something unexpected occurred. Rosser finally acknowledged his guilt more than a year after his arrest. In an effort to have his sentence reduced, he and the prosecutor entered into a plea deal. Also, the man asked his parents and 2 children from his ex-wife were among the people excluded from the investigation from being involved in the legal process. This resulted in the trial being finished in record time. Despite the DNA sample match, the trial might have taken years to complete if he had not admitted guilt. Rosser was consequently given a 55-year prison term. He also received a 5-year sentence for stealing a laptop. According to the assistant district attorney, this was the harshest punishment possible for a guilty defendant. Plea, however, if the investigation had been able to show that the murder was premeditated and planned, Rosser faced a much greater risk of being sentenced to death. Rosser might have been given this verdict. The man was sent to Texas's Rocheron prison, and his first chance at parole won't come until 2036. Rosser could be released early at the age of 55 because he was only 27 when the crime was committed. But if he completes his term, he won't be free until he is 82 years old. He exhibited a lack of eye contact with Jenna's family and friends throughout the trial. He was handcuffed and led into the courtroom wearing an orange prison jumpsuit. The man remained silent and unresponsive with his head bowed, only nodding to his parents when he saw them in the courtroom. The family of the deceased had the right to address the murderer in open court. They all 3 took advantage of this chance. Sister of Diana appeared in court 60, she said, standing a few centimeters from the offender. I hope Rosser will realize the terrible act he had committed. She said she would pray for him and that one day she would be able to forgive the man who killed her sister. Rosa may not have regretted his actions, according to Jenna's mother. She forced the murderer to meet her eyes directly and declared firmly that he would never be able to fully comprehend the horror he had inflicted on their family. Jenna's father initially decided against testifying at the trial but later changed his mind. He made a last-minute commitment to visit any prison where the roster is posted and expose himself as a monster. Additionally, he stated his intention to show up at the hearing when Rosser applies for parole in 27 years. In addition, Jenna's parents sued the proprietor of the apartment building. When their daughter complained to Rosser's boss about his behavior, they were certain that her words were not taken seriously. Rosser's keys weren't seized after his firing either, which shows the manager was careless. If Jenna's complaints had been taken seriously and detention had been paid for Rosser's inappropriate behavior, Jenna's parents think their daughter would still be alive today. The only thing that is still a mystery is Rosser's precise motivations. He admitted to the murder, but he remained silent about his motivations. Whatever the case, it is irrelevant now because his guilt is clear and he deserves to serve his entire life in prison. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching.
A woman mysteriously disappeared from her own home, and her friends decided to go to the police. At first, it looked as if she herself had gone somewhere, but with each new clue, the case became more and more creepy. Eventually, investigators were able to uncover the mystery, and the truth turned out to be quite frightening. Welcome to A to Z Crime Stories. Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. In New York City, Mindy Schloss was born in 1955. She relocated to Alaska when she was 25 and attended a local medical school there before earning her degree. After receiving a degree in psychiatry, the woman accepted a position as a nurse at Fairbanks Hospital. Many patients in Alaska's remote areas were unable to travel to the hospital on their own, so Mindy and her co-workers would use all available means of transportation, such as boats and airplanes, to reach them, even though the majority of the time she had to work in the field. She was passionate about her work and gave it her all. Mindy resided roughly 600 kilometers away from the Anchorage hospital. She flew to work, spent the week at a hotel, and returned home on the weekends. In August of that year, Mindy, 52 years old at the time, flew back to work after spending the weekend in Anchorage. She regularly requested her best friend Jerry to drop by her house during her absence to feed her cat and give him the medication he required. Her friend called her on Saturday, August 4, to discuss the situation, but Mindy didn't pick up. It seemed odd that she still hadn't been able to reach her all day, so Jerry called a mutual acquaintance who also hadn't reached Mindy all day. Jerry initially believed Mindy had left. She claimed to be away for work, but the next day she remained silent. When no one opened the door when her buddy's friend drove to her house, Jerry used her spare key. At first inspection, everything appeared to be in order. The house was clean, and there were no indications of a struggle or any other negative events involving Mindy. Only after leaving did the jurors notice anything odd. The front door's doorknob was loose, so the woman had used the screwdriver to tighten the screws. She then left and went to work. Jerry called the hospital where Mindy worked on Monday, August 6th, after learning where her companion had vanished to. She never showed up for work, which was extremely out of character for her, and she didn't call any of her co-workers to let them know she wasn't going to be there. All of this suggested that the woman may have experienced something, so Jerry chose to call the police. When Jerry and the investigator visited Mindy's residence once more after the police had taken a complaint of a missing person, they were unable to find any evidence of a break-in. Nothing of value was also gone from the premises, ruling out the likelihood that a burglar had entered the woman's residence. Some of the prescriptions Mindy kept at home were those that required a prescription from a doctor. They were in high demand among drug addicts, so any burglar would have most certainly taken them. When they got into the garage, they saw that Mindy's car was gone. It was also highly odd that the woman only used her car to move around town and always took a cab to the airport. The detectives came to the conclusion that the woman had experienced something quite awful. A forensic team searched the home for any hints, but they came up empty-handed. The hypothesis of a kidnapping was improbable. The police believed that Mindy may have been in an accident. She frequently traveled through rural areas where the terrain was rather hazardous. People can have gone from a cliff unintentionally or became prey to wild animals. However, the authorities were not any closer to solving the crime as a result of this argument. Decided to start looking for people who, in theory, might be connected to her disappearance. They started by checking on the acquaintance of Bob, Mindy, and Jerry. The police were able to immediately ascertain that the man was working far from the woman's home on the day of her disappearance because to the man's want to assist with the investigation. The cops were unsure about the precise time that Mindy vanished. Since Saturday, the woman has been in touch. Experts examined her computer and found that at 1:30 a.m., she used it for the last time. Police decided to ask the public for assistance later that day because they had no strong leads. They sent the missing woman's information to local TV stations and plastered leaflets regarding her whereabouts across the community. The following day, they started getting calls from witnesses, but the most of the leads were dead ends. People claimed to have seen Mindy in numerous locations, including in other states. These leads were never of any use. In the meantime, Bob and his co-workers made the decision to search the region where Mindy may have. The detectives tried a different approach and contacted the bank the woman used. They asked them to check to see if there had been any activity on her cards in recent days, and this is where a serious lead finally awaited them early Sunday morning, the day after Mindy went missing. Someone had withdrawn $500 from her debit card, the maximum amount allowed, and she had been out in the country quite frequently for berries or just out for a walk. Unfortunately, the search also produced no results. The bank's ATM video footage was promptly seized by the authorities, who discovered a terrible scene. It turned out that an unidentified individual had taken the money out. They were unable to recognize him because of the scarf covering his face. Only until his face was hidden from the camera's view did he remove the bandana. The only option left to the cops was to wait until the man attempted to use some person's card. The cops received another tip in the meanwhile. They discovered through Mindy's co-workers that she was preparing to remodel her house and had at one time employed employees. She and their boss had a disagreement on the reason for the work. Later, Mindy confessed to her co-workers that she was scared of him since he behaved suspiciously when he came to her house. Police checked on the man, but it turned out that he had a plausible explanation for why the woman vanished on that particular day. Another employee who visited her home on Friday about 7 p.m. was also questioned. The man was also uninvolved and he had no memory of anything odd happening that evening. Within a short period of time, detectives had the 500 charge on Mindy's card occurred again early in the morning, but this time from a different ATM, according to a new lead bank security report. The cops knew it was the same individual after reviewing the security camera, but there was something strange on the recording. The man took the cash out and walked away, but he soon went back to the ATM. Pushing buttons as he moved around it, he eventually left once more. After contacting the bank detectives, they learned what was causing his odd behavior. This time the police managed to find a witness who drove up to the exact same ATM when an unidentified man came out of there. According to the witness, he got on his bicycle and rode away. It was a significant lead since most people don't remember the ATM taking the card away to prevent the theft. The real owner can get it back by going to the bank with his ID. Of course, this was not an option for the criminal, so he lost access to Minnie's account forever. This time the police managed to find a witness. Detectives chose to interrogate everyone in the Mindy area because the available information was still insufficient to draw them closer to a clue. They inquired about any peculiar occurrences or suggested any suspect neighbors. Unexpectedly, a number of locals named a house that was close to Mindy's home. They claimed that there were always celebrations there. The locals were constantly making noise and upsetting the peace. The detectives got there and discovered that there were quite a few residents, but they were unwilling to speak with the detectives. A woman who lived just across the street from the house was the next place the detectives went. She claimed that she did not notice anything odd, but it was clear from the way she was acting that she was quite tense. The woman called the police station the following day and begged the detectives to meet, but not at her home. They met elsewhere and the woman told them a spooky tale. A man who lived across the street paid the detectives a visit not long before that. He claimed that police were patrolling the area and requested that she not let them know that he lived here. She heard someone strolling on her porch when she asked why he claimed to be on parole and did not want the police to know where he was at night. She noticed he was the same man when she peered out the window. He walked around, peered into a few windows, and then walked away. Because she was so terrified, the woman made the decision to call the police. Josh Wayne, who was 27 years old at the time, was his name, according to the detectives. When they put him through the database, they discovered that he had been found guilty of murder. He had been suspected of killing a woman by beating her 7 years prior, but a jury had found him not guilty. Josh spent 3 years in jail before being charged with tampering with evidence and given a 6.5-year prison term. He was let go. He was immediately recognized as a key suspect by early detectives. When authorities started looking for Josh, they learned from his housemates that he didn't own a car and primarily traveled by bicycle. However, there was just one issue. Man has vanished. Without a trace on Thursday, August 9th, police received a call from a local trucker who claimed to have seen Mindy's car in a parking lot close to the airport, giving them an unexpected new lead. He instantly recognized the automobile after seeing its photo in the newspapers. When detectives arrived on the site, they were able to verify that the car was actually Mindy's. They also observed that a nearby building had a surveillance camera directed at the parking lot, so they asked for a recording. It displayed a man operating this vehicle into on August 4 at 12:30 p.m. He exited the parking lot and appeared to wipe off his fingerprints by wiping down the door handle. Regrettably, the clarity of the camera prevented us from seeing his face. Although it took some time to analyze the samples and there was no assurance they would be helpful in the case, CSI was able to recover some samples while searching the car for prints or signs of DNA. Mindy's purse was on the passenger seat, which might have been a sign that she had been in the car with the offender. alive or dead. Using cutting-edge analysis technologies, they are now obtaining the desired outcomes. A search dog strategy was chosen by the detectives. Since Mindy had been missing for a week, few people thought this concept would work, but they had run out of ideas and turned to filming dogs. The service, both Mindy's car and the ATMs where the unidentified man had withdrawn cash, were visited by the dog. 3 streets away, at the woman's house, the dog followed the route and started walking down the street. She smelled the front door and went straight to the residence that Josh Wayne had formerly occupied. When the service dog pointed straight to the fact that Josh was in Mindy's car close to her house and those ATMs, the detectives, who up until that moment had not believed in the search dog concept, were taken aback. The exercise was repeated the next day by the police with a different search dog. The outcome was the same. The dogs made it to Josh's house after walking the entire distance. The detectives chose not to waste their time investigating, even if it was not unqualified proof that would be accepted in court. They proceeded to the suspect's home after obtaining a warrant for his arrest. But the man hadn't been there for days. After inspecting the building, they discovered the jacket that the mysterious man had been seen wearing on the security cameras by the ATMs. A cash withdrawal slip from Mindy's card was also discovered in the jacket's pocket. They then came across a woman's gold watch and showed it to Jerry right away. The watch belonged to Mindy, the woman said. In order to compare, the DNA samples discovered on the tests from items from Mindy's home matched, proving that Josh had been in the automobile that belonged to the missing woman. The police were concentrated on apprehending the culprit because the evidence was already significantly more serious. His name was on flyers that were distributed around the city, and they even rented a number of billboards. Detectives said that it was one of the biggest manhunts ever conducted in Alaska. Nearly all law enforcement agencies were involved in the investigation, and at one point locals reported any questionable material. Point after the police revealed ATM camera images, Lisa, a lady, approached them almost immediately. She claimed she had previously seen Josh and was certain he was the person in the picture. The fact that the police did not identify the primary suspect is what matters most in this instance, but what happened next is what made the case turn. Josh's second friend turned up at the police station with a confession. She had been driving him about town for the previous week to assist him get around. He left his bag in the back seat one day, and the teenager and her mother peered inside, where they discovered a phone in the gallery and several more ATM receipts. They also discovered a picture in which Josh is allegedly brandishing a gun for the police. Detectives were already concerned that the suspect may attack someone else while they were looking for him, and now that they knew his phone was also armed, their concerns were only raised. The officers pleaded with Josh's girlfriend to go with them and meet them with a tape recorder so they could record Josh. They would try to persuade him to discuss what he had done to Mindy, but the girl was too terrified and soon refused. She was compelled to participate despite her will nevertheless. On September 2nd, Josh showed up at her house and started yelling at her to give him her backpack. She had to quickly come up with an explanation after realizing she didn't have the backpack since the young woman had delivered it to the police. The young woman declined Josh's request to be taken somewhere far from here where he could escape the cops. She offered to let him remain at her house, but Josh fled since he felt uneasy. She decided to follow him covertly in her car and call the detectives along the way after realizing that she would now be safe until the cops caught the man. Josh eventually arrived at the residence of his friend and entered. Police, SWAT, and the FBI had already started to arrive on the area by that point. Everyone was concerned that the suspect would not give himself up without a fight, and utilizing force, those concerns came true. Josh held 2 persons hostage who were also there in the home. But after several hours of negotiation, a lawyer was able to persuade Josh to let up. He rarely spoke to the authorities during the interview, but the detectives were slow to accuse him of killing Mindy. Josh was only charged with swiping Mindy's bank card because at that point, they already believed the woman was most likely dead, but they couldn't prove it without her body. As a result, the FBI agent decided to get crafty. He recounted the accusations made against Josh and said they were all false. When Mindy went to the police to report the card theft, the investigator said that they had evidence that he was the one who had taken the money from someone else's card. The suspect became upset when he heard this and questioned what games they were trying to play with him. The FBI agent was ultimately persuaded by Josh's response that Mindy had been murdered, but the police still needed to locate Mindy's body in order to accuse Josh of the crime. They had no possibility of locating Mindy's remains if they became buried in the snow because it had started snowing early in that region. About 100 miles away from Anchorage, in the vicinity of the town of Wasilla, an electrician called the police on September 13th. He saw a woman's body in a wooded area and knew it was Mindy at once. The lab's experts verified that the deceased was in fact Mindy. The woman had been shot in the back of the head, according to the medical assessment, and her body had been burned to death. When the bullet was found, it was discovered that Josh had been captured using the same firearm that had fired the shot. The only thing left for the cops to do was to reconstruct the sequence of events that resulted in Mindy's demise. The specialists continued to search every square inch of her home for signs of Josh's presence in the interim. It was incredibly challenging to perform. They had to gather almost every hair from Mindy's home's floor and test it in the lab. Months passed, but ultimately was successful in locating a hair that belonged to Josh. The detectives now had concrete evidence that the suspect was present in the victim's home on May 18, 2008, 10 months after the murder, thanks to DNA tests that had proved this. Josh's ex-girlfriend Lisa, who had recognized him from a picture of him next to an ATM, declined to appear in court, which created an unusual situation as the prosecution gathered witnesses to testify against Josh. She frequently visited her ex-boyfriend incarcerated, and the duo once declared their investigators were surprised by this turn of events because they had intended to help Mary, but they soon recognized what was going on. Family members are not allowed to testify against one another under the U.S. Constitution, and Josh likely persuaded Lisa to marry him for this reason. There was just one issue. The marriage was quickly deemed null and void after it was consummated. Marriages between inmates were forbidden by the estate law. However, the investigators questioned Josh's extreme behavior in protecting Lisa from interrogation and testimony. Was it actually? Investigators tried to talk to the young woman but initially were unsuccessful. However, eventually Lisa herself contacted them and claimed that Josh confessed to her about the murder during one of her visits to the prison. According to Josh's story, there was a party at his house on Friday night, and Josh, who had no other means of support, decided to sneak into the house next. The young woman was likely aware of a lot more information. Josh flung open the door to the home and started looking around for valuables. He suddenly understood that if he continued to let Mindy live at this point, he would not be able to avoid going to jail. He seized the woman, led her to the restroom, and bound her hands since he didn't want to go back there. The criminal then went to his house to grab a gun, while also taking a few useful items to utilize in the kidnapping. He wrapped her legs in sacks and duct-taped them before going back to Mindy's house. He then brought the woman to the garage, put her in his own car, and drove out of town, leaving no trail. After a half hour of driving, he pulled off in a wooded area and took Mindy off the road, where he killed her. Josh then left her home after cleaning and vacuuming the carpet. The trial didn't start until the following spring. In exchange for Josh confessing to killing Mindy and another lady 7 years prior, the prosecution agreed to drop the death penalty. Josh concurred because the goal was to resolve two prominent cases simultaneously. Consequently, at the reading of the sentence, he was given a prison term of 99 years without the possibility of parole. Josh sobbed, but at one point the judge called him a coward for stealing the lives of two ladies, which caused things to get hot. "What about the man I killed?" yelled the criminal as he leaped to his feet. Right now, before he could continue speaking, attorneys seized him and put him to quiet. Until Josh himself gave authorities a fresh agreement in 2014, those yells kept the detectives busy for 5 long years. He consented to tell the truth about killing 3 guys in exchange for being moved from a local to a federal jail. Given that the criminal's request was so trivial, it appears that the standards were much higher there. The government agreed. Josh claimed that in 1994, when he was just 14 years old, he killed 1 man in Anchorage. In 1999, he committed murder and killed a 3rd man. The first 2 guys had been recognized a year later. On the same day he killed the woman, but the 3rd man's name is still unknown. Josh was definitely engaged in the killings, but the real concern for the investigators is whether he has any additional crimes to his credit that he is keeping quiet about. In any case, the authorities were able to permanently cut him off from society and stop the other murders that were certain to occur. Share your opinion on the story in the comments and don't forget to like it if you liked the video. Thanks for watching.
A woman's body was discovered in her own house. When the police began their investigation, they discovered several worrying leads. The more they investigated the case, the stranger and more terrifying the information became. They eventually learned the truth after a number of years, but nobody anticipated this turn of events. On March 29, 1948, Karen Gregory was born in Albany, New York. She was the oldest of 4 children, and from a young age she assisted her parents in caring for her siblings. The girl loved nature and spent a lot of time in the outdoors. She also enjoyed sports. After graduating from high school, she wanted to work in the field of art. Karen enrolled at Rochester's Nazareth College, where she graduated with a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Science. She then spent some time teaching art in an elementary school, before deciding to pursue a career as a graphic designer. She relocated to Florida in 1983 when she was 35 years old, where she met David McKee. He was a manager for a company that offered Vietnam War veterans consulting services, and he and Karen quickly grew close. The two were attracted to one another and dated for just over a year before David asked her to move in with him in Gulfport in the spring of 1984. Before this, Karen commuted frequently to David's home because she shared an apartment with a friend. On May 22nd, the woman accepted this offer and started gradually moving her belongings there. Karen finally packed up her apartment and left it empty after taking the last of her possessions. She admitted to being a little anxious to her neighbor. In order to speak at a conference, David had to travel to another state for work, and she would have to stay alone in his home for a full week. The woman left the apartment and went to her friend's home. There, they had a great time. Karen expressed to her friend how content she was with David and how happy she was to finally be moving in with him. After the friends finished talking around midnight, Karen went to David's house. He made several calls home the following day, but no one picked up. He called Karen's neighbor because he believed she might still be living in her old apartment, but the woman claimed she hadn't seen Karen in a while. David contacted Karen's sister and a few of her friends the following day, but none of them had seen her. All day long he tried to get in touch with her, but he never heard back. In an effort to reach Karen before she left for work on May 24th, David called the house once more in the early morning hours. However, there was still no response. He called her boss later and learned that she hadn't arrived for work. David was now extremely worried that something bad might have happened to Karen. Contacted the neighborhood hospitals and police departments to ask if they had seen anyone resembling Karen's description. He made the decision to call his neighbor Amy after learning that they had nodded. Amy looked out the window and answered in the affirmative as Karen's car parked in front of the residence. David's worry was only increased by this. He instructed Amy to visit the residence and rap on the door. He remained on the phone with her until she left to carry out his request because he was so anxious. There was no response when Amy knocked on the side door. She then circled the house and noticed that a window was open. Karen's name was repeatedly called out, but no one answered. When she pulled back the curtain and put her arm through the open window, she was astounded by what she discovered. She could see the hallway from the bedroom window where a woman's bloodied body was lying on the floor. Amy was hidden behind a wall and couldn't see the face, but she recognized the person as Karen, who, after she recovered from her shock, ran back to her own home where David was, keeping the call going. Before hanging up and dialing 911, she grabbed the phone and told him that something terrible had happened. Rapidly arriving medical personnel could only confirm Karen's demise. Due to the amount of blood throughout the house, even seasoned police officers were horrified as detectives started their investigation. Karen had fought her assailant all the way to the end. From the hallway to the front door, there were bloodstains. Several pieces of broken glass were scattered around. Investigators discovered that several hair strands matched. Karen's hair color was ingrained in the shattered glass. They hypothesized that she almost made it outside, before her attacker cornered her in the restroom. A bloody footprint on the floor gave investigators their first indication of the crime. There were no bloodstains on Karen's feet, so the police concluded that Karen's killer was responsible for the footprint. The killer was in the bathroom, but it was not clear why he was barefoot. Police requested any information regarding a black Ford Ranger pickup truck they were searching for. They made it clear that no conclusions should be made just yet because the driver's involvement in the young woman's disappearance has not been established. Additionally, the sheriff made a 24-hour tip line announcement. A separate number had to be assigned. On the 6th day, when the number of calls had surpassed several hundred, police made an announcement that they were recruiting volunteers to search the area. People are divided into groups and assembly points are set up. The volunteers' task was to search the area for anything that might be relevant, and this time, Bangor and Old Town, two nearby towns, were included in the search area. The police called received more than 500 responses. About 400 people from the area were present, along with 100 professionals from different counties. There were horse-drawn and off-road vehicle search parties. The authorities tried to use every resource they could, given the size of the operation and the challenging terrain. They even used aerial photography in the hopes that the footage might reveal information useful to the investigation. The police made a depressing announcement the day after the search, precisely 1 week after Nicole went missing. The body of the young woman was discovered nearby Old Town in a wooded area not far from Road 43. They had no pressing need to release any information, stating only that a service dog found the body, which was covered in branches. The police soon disclosed that they were investigating a homicide, and the following day, May 20th, they reported the arrest of a suspect. It turned out to be Kyle Dewey, a 20-year-old local. At the time, no information was available, and the public was kept in the dark for a while. He was formally charged with premeditated murder the following day. It was later discovered that he was already in prison when he was arrested. Prison. For evading the police and a motorcycle accident last year, the man had received a 90-day prison sentence. Kyle had been on the outside until 3 days before Nicole's body was found, when he started serving his sentence. The young lady had known Kyle for several months, according to her friends. She complained to several friends that Kyle had tried to kiss her the day before she vanished and that Nicole had to put up a fierce struggle to stop him. It was well known that he had custody of his 4-year-old daughter and resided with his parents. In addition, Kyle was seeing Sarah, an 18-year-old girl, and he worked for a nearby provider of disability care. The judge agreed to his attorney's request for a preliminary hearing to take place behind closed doors. The judge's decision was criticized as a result of the public and media not having access to information about the case. Several hundred locals gathered before Nicole's funeral on May 26th to pay tribute to her memory by launching. A judge eventually lifted the public disclosure ban on the case a few days after the funeral as a result of public pressure, and some disturbing details were revealed. Police first discovered that Kyle's computer was used to register the fake Facebook account, and that his IP address was used for all subsequent sessions. As a result, Kyle was responsible for tricking her out of the house just before the murder, and the medical examiner's report made it abundantly clear that the young woman had passed away on the day of the murder. Kyle's brother and his girlfriend, whom the suspect was dating, according to Sarah, Kyle confessed to her about the murder a few days after it occurred, were two of the police's key witnesses at the time of Sarah's disappearance. This took place right away after Sarah was summoned for questioning. She realized that although there was no proof, the police had suspicions about Kyle. He was questioned as well, but he responded that the day the young woman vanished, he was at work. Kyle informed his brother that Nicole was drawn to the man intended to make it appear as though Brian Butterfield had abducted her and was holding her captive in a remote location using a false Facebook account. The young woman, Kyle thought, would fall in love with her savior if he could find her and free her. To put it mildly, it all sounds odd, but there is more to come. Just keep in mind that this is the perpetrator's brother-reported account. The subsequent sequence of events went as follows. Kyle enticed Nicole to a remote area along Hudson Road. When Nicole arrived at the designated location, he was already there waiting for her, hiding in the bushes, his face covered by a ski hat. Her head was taped after he pounced on her, loaded her into his father's black Ford Ranger pickup truck and drove off. He said the car was parked close by. Kyle took her away from the scene of the kidnapping. The young woman showed no signs of life as he started to pull her out of the vehicle. When he realized that the duct tape was preventing her from breathing, she died. In a panic, he made the decision to keep his girlfriend from finding the body. Kyle repeated the tale while supplying more information. He claimed that on the way back to his house, he stripped Nicole of nearly all of her clothing and threw her out the window before hiding the body. This was done to ensure that his DNA would not be discovered by the police. The young woman's belongings, including several pieces of clothing, were discovered by the police. Almost exactly where Kyle had attacked Nicole was where they were. The crucial detail in this situation was that Kyle told his girlfriend almost exactly where he had struck her. The reason the police were able to find Nicole's body in the body was because Sarah went to them and gave them the whole story. Despite Kyle's refusal to accept responsibility, the situation was not in Kyle's favor when the police learned the full scope of the medical examination and more damning evidence arose against the suspect. Kyle's DNA sample was precisely matched by blood that was discovered under Nicole's fingernails. A few days after the murder, the boy was interrogated, and there were deep scratches on his face, attributed to a workplace injury he had. The injuries to the young woman's neck also provided further proof that strangulation was the cause of her death. This contradicted Kyle's claims that if he had taped the victim's mouth, there wouldn't have been any such injuries, as he told his brother and the young woman. The trial dragged on because his attorney asked for a psychological assessment, but an intriguing thing occurred a few months after his arrest. After a stolen gun was discovered in Kyle's house, he was charged with theft. The man had previously been detained for robbery on several occasions, but each time he was released after paying a fine. A trial was scheduled for February 2015 after an examination revealed Kyle to be entirely sane. The defendant was in custody prior to the start of the trial while awaiting trial. The correctional officer where Kyle reported to serve a sentence for eluding police and a motorcycle accident was one of the witnesses whose testimony Kyle's attorney sought to have removed from the case file. Kyle was there to serve a sentence. The officer claimed that the man was acting extremely anxious and even crying when questioned the cause of his anxiety. "It's not about the time limit. It's about what else I've done," Kyle allegedly said. The case started on February 22, 2015. According to Kyle's attorney, his client is not guilty of the murder and the investigation was totally biased. He was at home, the defense claims, and Nicole was attacked by someone else while he was away. Sarah, Kyle's girlfriend, was mentioned as a potential suspect. Nicole was allegedly hated by Sarah because of Nicole's relationship with Kyle. The attorney asserted that she had access to Kyle's computer and used it to set up a phony account on which to blame her boyfriend for the murder. This theory was unsupported by any evidence and was in conflict with the facts. Kyle used both his computer and his phone to access the fake account. Additionally, he changed his personal account to a fake one by logging in via one app. As a result, it was obvious when he logged out of one account and into another right away. Sarah was also not supported by any physical evidence, unlike Kyle, whose DNA was found on the victim's clothes, which the murderer threw away on his way home, as well as under her fingernails. The following witness was the actual Brian Butterfield, who claimed that Kyle had been angry with him for a long time because Brian had dated his ex-girlfriend. He believed that this was what prompted Kyle to set up a phony account in his name so that he could later use it to frame the young man. The prosecution also provided correspondence screenshots demonstrating that Kyle was speaking with both Nicole and other young women underage. The next witness was Kyle's coworker, who he worked with at a disability care business. The defense attorney for the defendant insisted that Kyle's face scratches developed while he was at work, but the witness refuted this. In accordance with his account, he and Kyle were at the residence of a woman who was afflicted with mental illness on May 11th and 12th. She attacked Kyle at one point when she became irate. leaving several scratches near his eye on his face. Kyle sought assistance at the hospital, but was informed the following day, May 13th. On his face, a co-worker notices fresh scars. This took place immediately after Nicole vanished. Another co-worker claimed that Kyle left the office at around 9 p.m. on the day Nicole vanished, and, despite being on duty all night, did not return until 6 in the morning. He also requested that no one be informed of his absence at the same time. 4 prisoners who Kyle had interacted with, while detained pending trial, were also called before the court. They all claimed that Kyle had told them he had killed the woman. He strangled her while giving the impression to others that it was an accident. He acknowledged that he had initially intended to carry out the crime. The testimony of an inmate named Scott Ford, who had spent the majority of his life behind bars and had a reputation for being knowledgeable about the legal system, was even more fascinating. Kyle decided to ask about the best way for him to get away with his crime after being in touch with him for a while. Then Kyle penned several versions of what had transpired in Nicole on paper and handed all of these accounts shared one thing in common. Kyle acknowledged that he had set up a false account and tricked Nicole into going to a deserted area, but he went on to give various accounts of what had happened. He initially claimed that his initial plan had been to simply kidnap her before rescuing her. However, he refused to accept duct tape, and the young woman died as a result. Nicole reportedly fainted from fear after being startled out of the bushes, according to him. Kyle drove while taping her mouth shut. He took her out of town and found she had no pulse. Another explanation was that he neglected to use the duct tape and the girl died in vain. According to a different account, the cow jumped out of the bushes and grabbed her torso before realizing that he had actually squeezed her throat, which caused her to pass out. As we can see, each of these tales appeared to be completely illogical, but they all contain information that will be extremely helpful for the investigation. Kyle went into great detail about where and how he attacked her and where he hid. He not only described the body but also the precise spot where, while wearing a ski mask, he had attacked the young woman. Only the murderer would have known these details since they were all kept a secret until the trial started. When the sheets were examined by experts, they discovered Kyle's DNA and fingerprints. The trial had its share of challenges. Kyle's younger brother, who had testified against him in court 2 years earlier, started to dispute the assertion that he had admitted to the killing. The difficulty lay in the brother had meticulously documented everything that had occurred, information that he could only have obtained from Kyle. Kyle was the only person who remained silent throughout the entire trial. Even when testifying for himself, he refused. He was given the opportunity to accept a deal from the investigation in which he would receive a lighter sentence for confessing, but he turned it down. The final court hearing, where the decision was made, took place on March 6, 2016. Kyle was found responsible for Nicole's deliberate murder. His family members and lawyer attempted because of his age and the fact that he had a young daughter, but the judge would not impose a lighter sentence. For both the murder and the kidnapping, Kylie was sentenced to 60 years in prison. The judge stated during the closing arguments that Kyle's guilt in the case was obvious and that the evidence against him was overwhelming. He fabricated several different accounts of what occurred and made every effort to get out of jail rather than expressing regret and confessing. The court declined to commute his sentence because of this. The judge was also inclined to think that Kyle had been working on a plan for weeks, a plan to kill Nicole. The girl's parents praised the sentence as just and expressed their desire for him to never be released from prison again. They also spoke about the risks of social media, using the murder of their daughter as an example, in a number of interviews and appearances on different television programs. They believed that if the perpetrator had not been given the chance to impersonate someone else online, the tragedy might have been prevented. However, Kyle has supporters. Even without fake accounts, we could eventually reach the point of murder. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching.
A woman was traveling home when she mysteriously vanished. Her friends started looking, and the police eventually joined them. Everyone hoped she would be okay and go home soon. but within a few days, such horrific details about the case came to light that even seasoned detectives were taken aback. We'll explain what happened to Gemma McCluskey today and why this case shocked the entire nation of Britain. On February 5, 1983, McCluskey was born in England. She was raised in a big family. In her teenage years, the girl had 2 older brothers and devoted parents. Gemma, she made the decision to give acting a shot, and in 1997 she was given a few bit parts. She was offered a part in EastEnders, one of the most well-known British TV shows. In 2000, when she was just 17 years old, Gemma made an appearance in over 30 episodes in total. After that, her mother fell seriously ill, and someone had to take care of her, forcing her to temporarily give up her acting career. After receiving a successful operation to remove a brain tumor, the woman unfortunately developed an infection during the procedure that was not curable. Gemma has since shared an apartment with her mother and Tony, her brother. Her brother looked after their mother while she was at work. She worked as a waitress in a number of bars and clubs. When Gemma was 29 years old in March 2012, she was taking care of her mother, going to work, and occasionally hanging out with friends as usual. However, one day, her friends noticed that they couldn't get in touch with her because she never picked up the phone, didn't reply to social media messages, and didn't show up online. Her friends were numerous, and they realized there was a problem right away and that Gemma hadn't been seen in a few days. Gemma had not been seen or heard from since their last meeting with her friend Erica on March 1st. Her brother visited the club where she was scheduled to work on March 3rd. But the staff reported that Gemma had not arrived. Tony and his brother Danny made the decision to call the police at that point. They didn't believe that their sister had just left on them because they knew she would never abandon their ailing mother without giving them prior notice. After receiving a report of a missing person, our own investigators questioned Tony first because he lived with Gemma and may have been the last person to see her. Tony's testimony was crucial. There was a problem, though. Tony had been using marijuana regularly for many years, and his addiction was well known to the family. He couldn't even recall the exact day he last saw her. As a result of this habit, he was constantly having memory and concentration issues. After seeing Gemma, he also remembered seeing his sister on March 1st. He had smoked a lot of marijuana, as usual, and nearly filled the apartment with water. Fortunately, Gemma was home and turned off the water after Tony decided to fill the bathtub and promptly forgot about it. She left the apartment after that to meet her friend Erica. Around 6 o'clock, according to Tony, is when he claimed to have left, and his sister remained unaccounted for. When Gemma and Erica talked about the bathtub incident, Gemma once more expressed her frustration with her brother's actions. He was a window washer by trade, but despite being 35 years old, he spent almost all of his money on marijuana, and Gemma frequently felt like she had to constantly take care of him. After reporting the incident to the police the following day, Erica met Tony to go over the situation once more and attempt to come up with a theory as to where Tony's sister might have gone. The man, who was depressed, frequently broke down in tears and held himself responsible for what had occurred. He claimed that as a result of the bathtub incident, Gemma had once more lost faith in him. His addiction had already upset his family members before. Gemma's friends turned to the neighborhood paper in the meantime and asked to write about her disappearance. Journalists interviewed Gemma's brother and produced an article. Everyone hoped that news coverage would help identify any potential witnesses to the woman's appearance on March 5th. The cousins of Gemma made the choice to plan extensive searches. They attracted a large number of volunteers who combed the streets and distributed flyers. In an effort to find leads, the sisters also actively shared information on social media. They did get their first lead on March 6th, but it wasn't what they were hoping for. In a call from an unknown number, Tony was instructed to bring £2 million to the Benefit railway station outside of London if he wanted to see his sister alive. Shortly after, the same unidentified caller made a second call and instructed him to bring 500 in Iraqi currency in addition to the money. On the third call that followed, the unidentified caller threatened to kill Gemma if they didn't get the money. Tony called his sister and asked to speak to her. but the caller informed him that she was locked in another room and that she frequently experienced violence, so he advised Tony to get the money out quickly. Danny, the other brother of the missing woman, was also called by the same person. Despite the fact that the number was concealed in each case, the police made an effort to track these calls. They were able to locate the caller, Sam Dunn, a 19-year-old Kent County resident, very quickly. His house was not far from the railroad. A judge issued a search warrant for Dunn's home after the caller's station, where the money was ordered to be brought, and Dunn was taken into custody. The boy later admitted during questioning that he and his friends saw a post on social media about the woman's disappearance and decided to play a joke. So the police quickly came to the conclusion that the boy had nothing to do with Jenna's disappearance. There were two numbers, Tony and Danny, but investigators soon found that this story also contained errors. The young man claimed the calls where he was merely seated next to him and had made something for him. The police were able to identify the caller as Sam and were unable to locate any additional parties. The court disapproved of the boy's joke as a result, and the boy was given a 6-month prison term. Once more, the detectives lacked any leads. By reconstructing the events of that day, they were able to determine that Gemma left Erica's apartment around 1:17 p.m. and went home. She made several calls to Tony along the way and got home at 1:50 p.m. The CCTV footage proved this. Even though the police were almost certain that Gemma had been kidnapped by the time her phone was turned off after 18 minutes and had since been turned on, there was something odd about the timing of her movements. How could he have done that 18 minutes after the woman arrived home if, as is most likely the case, her kidnapper had turned off her phone? The most likely scenario is that Gemma was attacked inside her apartment, but Tony was present and their mother was in the hospital at the time. Investigators discovered a concerning conclusion. Could her brother be involved in her disappearance in some way? He smoked a lot of marijuana, and people who have serious addictions are frequently capable of monstrous acts. After further investigation, detectives discovered that Gemma's sister and mother had reported Tony to the police on numerous occasions because he occasionally displayed aggressive behavior and even attacked Gemma. Questions were also raised about the brothers' actions during the investigation. While the friends of Danny and Gemma were actively searching, Tony sat at home and expressed his hopes for return of Gemma and wanted to be at home in case she did. He only joined the search once the case started to receive attention from major TV networks. Police contacted him once more in an effort to elicit more detailed information about what transpired that day. Tony claimed that he last saw his sister between 1:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. and that she left after that because her phone was turned off at 2:08 p.m. His account raised doubts. However, Tony was under the influence of marijuana almost constantly, so relying on his memory would not be prudent. Unbiased. On March 6th, 5 days after Gemma vanished, there was a very alarming development in the case. A suitcase struck a boatman as he was navigating a London canal at some point. It opened after the collision, and the stunned boatman saw what was inside. Inside was a body of a person. Upon closer inspection, experts discovered that the torso was missing its head, legs, and arms. The lower back of the body belonged to a woman and bore a bow tattoo that matched Gemma's. Investigators immediately requested DNA testing to determine. They used DNA from her toothbrush to fully match the body and identify it. Gemma McCluskey was the deceased. The woman's death and the horrifying information that her body was discovered in a suitcase shocked her family and friends. Nobody could understand how she could have experienced something so terrible. Everyone was waiting for the police to solve the murder case they were currently handling. They issued a resounding statement on March 7th. The very next day, researchers revealed that Tony McCluskey had been detained on a murder suspicion. He was unable to recall the events of that day, and his odd actions while looking for Gemma indicated that he was not at all interested in doing so and that he knew she had already passed away. Tony was the most likely suspect due to the circumstances surrounding her disappearance as well. Police believed that he may have snapped and killed his sister using large amounts of marijuana, given that they had a fight that day over the overflowing bathtub and he was known to have an addiction. This over time can cause severe mental issues, and a person is fully capable of committing impulsive crimes. Detectives grew more certain that Tony might be the murderer during the initial interrogation. He didn't dispute his guilt or that his sister was murdered. Instead, he simply replied, "No comment." Investigators looked through his smartphone and discovered messages from his sister. He sent Gemma a message the day after she vanished with the words "I love you" and a few other sentiments. He wrote, "Jim, call me when you get this message." Several hours later, "What will we be eating tonight? Do you have work tonight?" Detectives discovered a peculiar fact. Despite years of correspondence with his sister, he never once confessed his love for her. Instead, he wrote to his girlfriend the day after his sister vanished to apologize for not writing the previous evening. All of this did not indicate his guilt, but the police soon discovered much more compelling evidence. They discovered that on the day that Gemma vanished, Tony used a false name to order a taxi to a location close to the house. Tom discovered the route from the company's detectives after they reviewed footage from nearby security cameras. They could see Tony putting a sizable suitcase in the trunk of the car in the opening frames of the video that was recorded during the man's taxi ride. It was evidently very weighty, and the driver's testimony supported this assertion. He inquired about the contents of the suitcase after observing the man attempting to lift it. It was, according to Tony, a sizable music system. He requested to be taken to the canal side street where his sister's body would eventually be discovered. After questioning the neighborhood residents, the police identified one witness, a student who was on her apartment's balcony when she noticed a man dragging a sizable suitcase toward the canal. When experts looked at the taxi truck, they discovered blood traces. It was identified as belonging to Gemma by DNA testing. Detectives were convinced Tony was transporting the same suitcase that contained his sister's body after gathering these clues, and on March 10th he was arrested, accused of murder. When the police searched their apartment, they discovered even more concerning evidence: a knife with barely perceptible blood traces, as well as blood stains in the bathroom that they had attempted to remove. All of this pointed to the woman being murdered in her own home. But one particular incident left the detectives with some unanswered questions. There should have been a lot more blood, as the woman's head, arms, and legs had been severed from her body. The drainage pipes in the entire house were examined by experts, but they did not. They thought Tony may have laid something like plastic wrap or a tarp on the bathroom floor before gradually disposing of the blood with a lot of cleaning supplies after discovering noticeable blood traces there. Tony was observed purchasing trash bags the day after the murder on store security cameras. Investigators believed that he could use them to remove the body's remaining components from the house. Soon after this version was verified, divers who kept searching the canal discovered bags with legs and arms there without DNA testing. The fact that they belonged to Gemma was already known to all, and later laboratory experts could only confirm this. Investigators changed their strategy because Tony resisted speaking to them despite having a substantial body of evidence against him. The police showed his father's surveillance footage that showed Tony loading the suitcase into the taxi's trunk on the day Gemma was killed. The father agreed to speak with his son in an effort to obtain a confession because he was certain that he was responsible for the murder. However, it only partially succeeded. During Tony explained what had happened that day to his father during the conversation. He claimed that Gemma came home and ignited the argument over the overflowing bathtub by pleading with her brother to vacate her apartment. Gemma allegedly grabbed a knife when Tony made the decision to go to his room, and Tony lost all memory of what happened after that. The story sounded like an attempt to shift responsibility for the murder, so the investigators didn't believe it for a second and kept looking for more proof. Police discovered Gemma's head on March 9th, and finally, experts were able to identify the cause of death because it occurred in the same canal. The injuries on the woman matched the kitchen knife discovered in her apartment, and she had sustained several blows from a sharp object. Detectives have since been working to prepare the case for trial, and Tony has been detained. The victim's brother gradually started to admit his guilt throughout the nearly one-year trial. He wrote to his father frequently, but he insisted that he couldn't recall the murder's final moments. Acknowledged guilt for killing a sister. He claimed that he went into a virtual coma and lost control during the argument. Tony insisted that he never intended for his sister to pass away and that he is incapable of acting in such a way while being rational. The court case started in January 2013. The prosecution thought Tony became enraged when his sister asked him to leave the apartment during their argument. He simply wouldn't have had enough money to rent his own place given his propensity for marijuana. Perhaps this had an impact, significant part in what followed. The prosecution asserted that Tony fatally stabbed his sister after doing so. Based on the experts' findings, he took the body to the bathroom, laid down something akin to a tarp there, and used CCTV to dismember it there. Gemma's torso was placed in a suitcase and dumped into the canal by Tony. After that, he made several trips with garbage bags filled with additional body parts and other pieces of evidence, some of which he also threw into the water. His father was unable to bear to even listen. He left the courtroom to put an end to it all, and he didn't come back until they had finished talking about the specifics of his daughter's murder. Although Tony didn't remember it at all, he acknowledged that he most likely killed Gemma. He claimed that it might have been self-defense after his sister allegedly yelled at him while holding a knife. He did not know what happened next. His explanation was viewed as a blatant lie by the prosecution. An invited witness, a psychotherapist, stated that memory loss brought on by marijuana use is extremely rare, and additionally, Tony had a clear plan to dispose of the body in order to conceal what he had done. Even though shock and amnesia should have subsided quickly, it took him many hours. In addition to dismembering her body and scattering the pieces throughout the canal, he also dialed a taxi under a false name and scrubbed the bathroom floor thoroughly afterward. All of this suggested that Tony was conscious of his actions and had a strategy to avoid punishment by destroying all evidence. Gemma's early years in court. A friend also gave a testimony in which she disclosed that from a young age, her brother had been beating and humiliating her. Gemma occasionally had to cover up the signs of physical abuse with sunglasses. The witness claimed that Tony had no feelings for his sister and had always hated her. Only because it was convenient for him did he move in with her and their mother. He didn't even have to buy food or pay rent. Tony's lifestyle was ideal for him because he spent almost all of his income on marijuana. However, when his sister attempted to evict him, he lost it and murdered her. Tony was found guilty of murder by the jury after the trial's conclusion on January 30th. He was given a life sentence with the option of parole after 20 years. The victim's body was disposed of like a true maniac, the judge said in his closing remarks, and it appeared that Tony hoped it would never be discovered. There was no indication that the murderer felt regret for what he had done because he exhibited no emotion during the reading of the verdict or the trial itself. After Tony started serving his sentence, he was moved to a different prison because someone had set a price on his head. It is unknown if this had anything to do with Gemma's murder or if he had argued with some other prisoners. After making an effort to stand by his son during the entire trial, Tony's father ultimately made the decision to stop communicating with him. The man claimed that he could not abandon Tony because he was his own son and he would lose 2 children at once. However, in the end, the man realized that Tony had no remorse for what he had done. Even then, Tony did not seem to have any strong feelings. It seemed that his own family did not matter to him at all. Their mother passed away the same year that Tony didn't care about his own sister at all. The worst part is that none of this can be attributed to drug abuse. He had been abusing and humiliating Gemma since she was a young child, so there is no excuse for what he did. The realization of what kind of monster Tony is forces Tony's brother and father to live with that realization for the rest of their lives. Genuinely is. Feel free to share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching.
A young woman never made it home after leaving work with plans to pick up her son and take him shopping. Her abandoned automobile was discovered 5 hours later, the door open, headlights on, and engine running, close to another town. When the truth was eventually revealed, the police launched a search, and the case quickly took a very unexpected turn. Even seasoned investigators were taken aback. They had not anticipated finding the truth in the manner that they did, nor did they anticipate such a resolution. On October 27, 1972, in the American city of Decatur, Illinois, Karen Slover was born. She met Michael Slover, her future husband, at Richland Community College after graduating from high school. Their son Colton was born less than a year after they were married in 1992, following their time in college. The pair had to put in a lot of work to provide for their child's needs, as well as their own. Karen had to return to work a few days after giving birth because of this. Michael spent the most of his working days with his parents, who had volunteered to look after the child. Karen worked at a number of different places over the ensuing years before settling on the local newspaper. Worked in the advertising division, was able to rapidly establish a rapport with the team, and was generally happy with her position. The pair's relationship started to go south a few years after the birth of their son. Karen told acquaintances that Michael would frequently lose his cool and strike her when they were arguing. She chose to seek for divorce as a result, and the court granted her custody of Colton. Nevertheless, her pay from the newspaper did not allow her to employ a babysitter for her child. Thus, she was unable to do so. The parents of Michael consented to go on, covering for her at work while she was with him. She started dating David Swan after the divorce. The two of them lived apart, but they were in regular contact. In 1996, when her kid was 3 years old, Swan and her son got along well and had no significant issues in their connection. Karen started to consider relocating to a different location and attempting a career as a model. She began searching for positions that would suit her needs, and shortly after, she got an invitation from a significant modeling agency in Georgia. The relocation had been much anticipated by her. But on September 27th, she worked at the editorial office until the very last minute to save money for her first date with her son. At approximately 5 o'clock in the evening, Karen told her coworkers that she would be picking up Colton from his grandparents and taking him to the mall. Karen never picked up her son that evening, despite the woman's plans to attend her acquaintance's wedding and her desire to purchase a suitable attire. The woman went gone for several hours. At this point, she didn't get in touch with roughly 10 p.m. That evening, a patrolman in the vicinity of Champaign, Illinois, saw a suspicious-looking vehicle parked on the shoulder of Highway 72. The headlights were on, the engine was running, and the driver's door was open. When the police got closer, he saw that no one was inside the car or in the vicinity, contrary to his first assumption that the driver was attempting to address the car's issues. The cops discovered Karen's documents in a woman's purse inside the vehicle, a box of food from a cafe, and a half-eaten chocolate bar. Everything suggested that the woman had just gotten out of the car and was going to be back any moment, but she was nowhere to be seen. When the police looked up the license plates on the vehicle, they discovered David Swan was the owner. When he got in touch with him, he found out that Karen had borrowed the man's car while hers was being fixed. According to him, the mother was scheduled to pick up her son from her grandparents that evening, so as the automobile was being brought to the police station, investigators went to their house. Police station, where it was examined more thoroughly by the forensic specialists. The woman was scheduled to arrive soon after work, according to the parents of Karen's ex-husband, but she didn't show up at all during the day. There was still Colton, and his mother could not have abandoned him. The police started to think that the automobile theft did not go through as planned, or that the woman might have been taken. The placement of the car was determined to be inconsistent with the events of that evening, which was observed by detectives right away. Karen went to her after leaving the office. Before heading to the store, Osmond used to live with his parents. She had the wisdom to find her automobile about 60 kilometers away. This implied that a criminal might have placed the car there in an attempt to confound authorities. The woman herself had to pick up her kid and get ready for a wedding that was scheduled for the following day, so she could not have ended up close to another city. As experts searched the vehicle for any traces, such fingerprints, police chose to speak with staff members at shops, salons, and hair salons. Prescience. They went there the following day and showed them pictures of Karen, but nobody had seen her. Although fingerprints were not found in the car, forensic specialists thought something was off. Cement residues were discovered on the passenger seat, although David Swan said they weren't there when he gave the car to his girlfriend. Questions were also raised when multiple tall grass stalks were discovered in the salon. There were a few loose coins inside the automobile, which was parked on an unvegetated section of the road. However, it did not produce a lot of credible leads. Following word of Karen's disappearance, friends, family, and coworkers launched extensive searches. While some groups went door to door in the city, others put out flyers along the route where her car was discovered. The women worked for a newspaper, and the management offered a prize of $10,000 for information leading to her location. However, as of October 1st, none of this worked. After receiving a worrisome call, fishermen observed the 50-kilometer from Decatur, on the coast of Lake Shelbyville, is a waste bag. They opted to carry it with them to dispose of later because they thought it odd that someone had left trash in such an abandoned area. The men soon discovered, though, that it was far from trash. The fishermen made the decision to examine the contents of the bag because it was heavy and well sealed with tape. The sight of a woman's head inside startled them. The moment the investigators realized that Karen might be the victim, they asked to see her dental records. Prove her identity. Their suspicions were validated. The head really belonged to her. As this was going on, divers and police combed the water, quickly discovering multiple other bags containing additional portions of Karen's body. Medical professionals determined that the woman died from 7 gunshot wounds. Following the unidentified perpetrator's dismemberment of her body, possibly with a gasoline saw, her body was placed in bags with an extra chunk of concrete added for weight. Investigators surmised that the murderer hurled the pieces from a lakeside bridge. They even discovered prints on the railings, but these fragments were insufficient for a comparative analysis. Even after a few more packages turned up and washed up on the coast in the days that followed, the authorities were still unable to locate every portion of the victim's body. Investigators deduced that the person who killed Karen was probably someone who knew the victim well and harbored hatred for her, given the ferocity of her murder. This clarified why the offender used 7 shots in all. Because of this, they started searching her close friends and acquaintances for potential possibilities. Detectives were informed by the woman's friends that her ex-husband had threatened and occasionally physically assaulted Karen during their disagreements. The detectives chose to question him after this immediately raised concerns. Michael claimed to have spent the entire day at his 3 jobs as a bar bouncer, a karate instructor, and a security guard at a supermarket store. The man left the business after his shift. He worked out at the gym right away at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He then went home, showered, and headed straight out to work at the bar. Upon thorough investigation, the man's account was found to be credible, and his alibi held up for the entire day. Michael was seen by many at all 3 of his jobs, and the investigator even noted the precise moment when Karen left work, and her car was discovered. This gave Michael a strong alibi for the whole day, and eliminated him from the investigation. As that happened, everything became a lot more intriguing. It was discovered that David Swan had been arrested for violence in the past, and had also pretended to be a police officer. In addition, the man's mental health issues resulted in his being admitted to a mental health facility following the disappearance of his fiancée. He took an active part in the hunt and never passed up the chance to speak with reporters and do interviews. The police saw this as a little suspect action, as David attempted to draw as much attention to himself as potential. They surmised that the man was attempting to avoid being suspected, which is common when the murderer is a close relative of the victim. This individual may be the most involved in the media, urging the authorities to apprehend the offender and maintaining a central position during the entire inquiry. David also gave false information to his acquaintances on his relationship with Karen. He informed them that they will soon tie the knot, but according to her pal, the couple had only been dating for a month and Karen wasn't even considering getting married. Investigators also discovered at this point that David was the owner of a chainsaw, which he occasionally used to butcher deer after hunting. Considering that Karen's body was mutilated in a like fashion, this served to confirm suspicions against him. Apart from that, the man had a gun the same caliber that was used to murder the deceased, but the biggest problem was that he had an alibi for the night the woman vanished. David was scheduled to serve as a chauffeur at his friend's wedding, but he arrived significantly late. Consequently, the man was without an alibi for approximately 45 minutes, during which time Karen was murdered. With everything taken into consideration, the investigators came very close to concluding that he was the murderer. The individual was interrogated for almost 4 hours in an attempt to extract a confession. The police heard something intriguing when he started to recount all he had done that night. After David claimed to have taken money out of an ATM, the detectives asked to see footage from the device's camera right away. They were shocked to learn that this narrative was true. David did take out a cash withdrawal at the time to complete his alibi. Immediately, all suspicions were removed from the man since he was physically unable to kill Karen and drive the car to another city. The detectives had very much ran out of leads by this point. One additional action that might eventually lead them to the murderer was taken. In the city proper, tall grass like the kind in Karen's car was frequently discovered abandoned or on outskirts parcels of land. It was continuously cut down, as mandated by law. The police spoke with locals as they strolled about the city's periphery, urging them to report any unusual activity they may have noticed. In an attempt to identify further suspects, the investigators persisted in questioning Karen's friends and family. It was revealed to them that the woman's relationship with her ex-mother-in-law had not always been cordial. Even though her grandson had a mother of his own, Jeanette Slover was quite close to him and did not want to part with him. The oddest revelation was still to come. Jeanette appeared to view Colton as her own child rather than her grandchild, and Karen occasionally had to physically remove him from their home. After learning that Jeanette had periodically given Colton the runaround, the police decided to re-interview Slover and get a closer look at her. Jeanette stated that she had spent the entire day at home with her grandson, and that when Karen failed to arrive at the scheduled time, she attempted to contact her on their home phone. But the woman chose not to respond. After requesting call logs from their residents, the authorities discovered that Slover had never spoken to Karen on that particular day. Instead, their phone had made numerous outgoing calls to their son Michael's number. Less than an hour had passed since Karen's ex-father-in-law left the house to buy Colton toys at a nearby store, he told the police. Upon verifying this information, the inspectors discovered that the business had never carried toys made by that particular manufacturer. The man's absence around the time of Karen's death raised suspicions. The investigators started to take Slover's involvement seriously and even came up with a potential reason. Considering how devoted Jeanette was to Colton, the victim was preparing to relocate to another state to pursue a career as a model, and her son would have followed her. Theoretically, she might have killed him to prevent him from leaving her. It was also discovered by the investigators that Slover owned an automobile company. They had a sizable piece of property that was turned into a used car parking lot, but it has been mostly idle for a number of years. Similar to the ones that had been found in bags containing pieces of Karen's remains, the area was strewn with broken concrete blocks when the police arrived after obtaining a search warrant. The detectives were unable to verify that they were the same blogs, though. Furthermore, they hired a lawyer after failing to locate any proof and refusing to speak with the police any longer. At that point, the inquiry had stopped because the investigators had no more leads. It wasn't until 1998, 2 years later, that it was picked up again by a different group of investigators who wanted to look into the area Slover's shop was located in. They thought that Karen might have been murdered there, and that there had to have been some proof left. Regarding the Slover family, they had all relocated to a different state during that period. Colton was residing with them prior to the relocation, having been put up by Michael's sister Mary. Hired repair workers. This worried corporations, but cops demanded proof. In 1998, forensic experts and military installation authorities assisted investigators in their second hunt. They needed as many personnel as possible to cover every square inch in 6 months. They inspected each stone's top layer for blood before fruiting. Karen wore rivets and a button in her jeans on murder day. After that, she found another blouse button. This supported the police's argument that the woman's body was sliced and stored on business property. While their daughter Mary watched Colton, investigators suspected Jeanette and her husband. Jeanette shot Karen directly when she picked up her son. Karen and her husband brought her body to their shop, but not the buttons. The police determined Karen's ex-husband cut the lawn the night of the murder, after talking to every neighbor. Only the investigators' version was supported. Jeanette and her husband drove Karen's car into beautiful grass from the city. Michael knew and helped his parents hide the crime. The grass inside the car may have confused investigators. Another witness told detectives the Slovers burnt something on the premises the day of the murder. They disposed of evidence this way and more. Karen's body was found in the packages with the most horrible evidence, shocking the police. Slover and a dog shed black hair on the cassette. A warrant was issued after investigators sampled the Slover's black Labrador's dog brush. Police found a complete DNA match in the brush, corroborating the family's case. Jeanette and her husband strengthened their relationship for everyone. They hurried to sleep their dog out of fear it was engaged in the crime, but it was too late. On January 27, 2000, officials arrested Jeanette, her husband, and her son after this proof. All three were accused of murder. Although the family denied it, trials lasted until 2002. Jury convicted them despite evidence and testimony. Michael, his father, and Jeanette earned 65 and 60 years in prison in 2003. Judge rejected their appeal. The story seemed over, but Karen's child had further issues. Mary, Michael's sister, adopted him. The court obtained custody over Karen's parents. Do Mary know about her relative's murder charges? If she watched Colton while her parents stole the body, she may have been an accomplice. Karen's parents kept asking the court for exclusive custody and parental rights for Mary. Following the judge's order, Colton lived with his maternal grandparents in 2003. Mary hated Karen throughout this process, and the court found she sought to make the child forget his biological mother. Mary frequently told acquaintances she hoped her dad was alive. They're all serving time. Jeanette's husband and son can be released after 2030, but she can be released early in 2029 at 80. They failed to appeal the verdict and claim innocence. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching. A woman's body was discovered in her own house. When the police began their investigation, they discovered several worrying leads. The more they investigated the case, the stranger and more terrifying the information became. They eventually learned the truth after a number of years, but nobody anticipated this turn of events. On March 29, 1948, Karen Gregory was born in Albany, New York. She was the oldest of 4 children, and from a young age she assisted her parents in caring for her siblings. The girl loved nature and spent a lot of time in the outdoors. She also enjoyed sports. After graduating from high school, she wanted to work in the field of art. Karen enrolled at Rochester's Nazareth College, where she graduated with a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Science. She then spent some time teaching art in an elementary school, before deciding to pursue a career as a graphic designer. She relocated to Florida in 1983 when she was 35 years old, where she met David McKee. He was a manager for a company that offered Vietnam War veterans consulting services, and he and Karen quickly grew close. The two were attracted to one another and dated for just over a year before David asked her to move in with him in Gulfport in the spring of 1984. Before this, Karen commuted frequently to David's home because she shared an apartment with a friend. On May 22nd, the woman accepted this offer and started gradually moving her belongings there. Karen finally packed up her apartment and left it empty after taking the last of her possessions. She admitted to being a little anxious to her neighbor. In order to speak at a conference, David had to travel to another state for work, and she would have to stay alone in his home for a full week. The woman left the apartment and went to her friend's home. There, they had a great time. Karen expressed to her friend how content she was with David and how happy she was to finally be moving in with him. After the friends finished talking around midnight, Karen went to David's house. He made several calls home the following day, but no one picked up. He called Karen's neighbor because he believed she might still be living in her old apartment, but the woman claimed she hadn't seen Karen in a while. David contacted Karen's sister and a few of her friends the following day, but none of them had seen her. All day long he tried to get in touch with her, but he never heard back. In an effort to reach Karen before she left for work on May 24th, David called the house once more in the early morning hours. However, there was still no response. He called her boss later and learned that she hadn't arrived for work. David was now extremely worried that something bad might have happened to Karen. Contacted the neighborhood hospitals and police departments to ask if they had seen anyone resembling Karen's description. He made the decision to call his neighbor Amy after learning that they had nodded. Amy looked out the window and answered in the affirmative as Karen's car parked in front of the residence. David's worry was only increased by this. He instructed Amy to visit the residence and rap on the door. He remained on the phone with her until she left to carry out his request because he was so anxious. There was no response when Amy knocked on the side door. She then circled the house and noticed that a window was open. Karen's name was repeatedly called out, but no one answered. When she pulled back the curtain and put her arm through the open window, she was astounded by what she discovered. She could see the hallway from the bedroom window where a woman's bloodied body was lying on the floor. Amy was hidden behind a wall and couldn't see the face, but she recognized the person as Karen, who, after she recovered from her shock, ran back to her own home where David was, keeping the call going. Before hanging up and dialing 911, she grabbed the phone and told him that something terrible had happened. Rapidly arriving medical personnel could only confirm Karen's demise. Due to the amount of blood throughout the house, even seasoned police officers were horrified as detectives started their investigation. Karen had fought her assailant all the way to the end. From the hallway to the front door, there were bloodstains. Several pieces of broken glass were scattered around. Investigators discovered that several hair strands matched. Karen's hair color was ingrained in the shattered glass. They hypothesized that she almost made it outside before her attacker cornered her in the restroom. A bloody footprint on the floor gave investigators their first indication of the crime. There were no bloodstains on Karen's feet, so the police concluded that Karen's killer was responsible for the footprint. The killer was in the bathroom, but it was not clear why he was barefoot. After examining the victim's body, medical professionals determined that she had sustained about 20 stab wounds and had been subjected to violence. Experts also removed biological material from the murderer. Sadly, DNA testing was not available in 1984, so this clue was ineffective in identifying the murderer. Several bloody fingerprints were also discovered on her body, but they couldn't be used because they were too smudged. Experts estimate that the woman was attacked the same night she returned home from her friend's house because she was killed, about 30 hours before she was found. Another element caught the eye of the viewer right away. As soon as the police and medical personnel arrived, they noticed Karen's body was covered in a lace corset over a shirt. Evidently, the offender did this. After investigating the scene thoroughly and gathering all relevant information, the police gave Karen's friends permission to begin clearing up. The women didn't want David to arrive and witness all this horror. All of the victim's friends and acquaintances knew how much he loved her and wanted to at least somewhat lessen his suffering. David had to travel across the country to his conference because it took a long time to get home, and in the meantime, the detectives started questioning the neighbors. The crime rate was incredibly low, and the neighborhood was regarded as being quite prestigious and secure. They even had a neighborhood watch and many residents who knew one another. When neighbors keep an eye on the peace and notify the police of any suspicious activity, they are in agreement. The neighborhood watch did not carry out its duties in this instance, though. Detectives learned that 16 locals were attacked on May 23rd at 1:15 a.m. None of them called the police after hearing a piercing female scream because they all claimed that the scream quickly stopped, and they did not get the impression that anyone might be in danger. Even the neighborhood watch leader, who practically lived across from the victim, did not think it was necessary to call the police. He heard a muffled scream while working on his motorcycle in the garage and listening to the radio. The man left the garage and walked down the street without seeing anything odd before coming back. On the morning of May 23rd, a neighbor who lived across from David made an intriguing observation. She noticed that his front door was open, and that night she also heard a scream, but she didn't connect the two. One specific element of her account stood out. The door was lit when the police responded to the call. Given that the body had been in the residence for about 30 hours, the perpetrator might have tried to hide his tracks by returning and shutting the door. Notably, none of the notable properties displayed any indications of forced entry. Doors. Despite the fact that there were no indications of forced entry, detectives theorized that the perpetrator might have entered through the back window. Karen either knew the killer and let him in herself, or she left it open the entire night. Another intriguing observation was provided to the detectives by the neighborhood watch chief. An unidentified man pulled up to Karen's home in the evening of the day following her murder. He exited the vehicle, rapped on the door a few times, and continued to scan the area. He then went back to the vehicle, He returned a short while later, holding a piece of paper in his hand, placed it on Karen's windshield, and then started his car. As soon as they arrived, the police checked the vehicle and discovered a note that read, "Karen and David, hi, I stopped by around 7:15 p.m. but didn't see any signs of life. I have what you requested, but I doubt I'll be back because I have a lot to do tonight." Given that Karen had already been dead for almost a minute when this person arrived, the detectives immediately noticed the warning that there were no signs of life. Such a choice of words throughout the day was very unsettling. Investigators searched for Peter, who was mentioned at the end of the note. He had actually been right there all along, it turned out. The man visited their home soon after learning about the body's discovery from Karen's former neighbor. The man actively participated and responded to all inquiries. He voluntarily gave them his fingerprints and revealed what, in Peter's account a few days earlier, he was doing close to the victim's home. Despite the fact that David was already scheduled to leave for a week-long business trip, Karen allegedly informed him that David would also be attending the dinner when she called and invited both of them. Peter was also questioned by the detectives about what he meant in the note when he said, "I have what you asked for." The man claimed that he had borrowed a cassette from them and intended to give it back. Another oddity was that Peter allegedly failed to notice the numerous broken windows or the almost completely covered path to the front door. Windows. The man insisted that during their conversation, he hadn't noticed anything or paid any attention to it. An extensive cut on Peter's hand was spotted by one of the detectives. The man covered the scratch when the policeman examined his hand and remarked that he always gets scratches after playing with dogs or fixing his car. The detectives decided to check his alibi because all of the aforementioned seemed very suspicious. Peter claimed that he was sleeping at home the night of the murder, and his neighbor told the police that this was true. Didn't rush to rule him out of the running because an alibi like that could easily be a fabrication. However, the detectives quickly identified another suspect, David, Karen's boyfriend. He claimed that night that he was sleeping in his hotel room and was in Rhode Island, which is 2,000 kilometers from his home. However, the police discovered a very intriguing clue at the crime scene in a local Rhode Island newspaper published on May 23rd, the day Karen was killed. The detectives began to wonder if it was real because it was so strange. Before his upcoming conference appearance, David could have taken a flight to Florida, murdered his girlfriend, and then come home. They estimated travel and flight times from airports and came to the conclusion that it was feasible. Since David allegedly slept alone in his hotel room that night, no one was able to verify his alibi. The neighborhood watch chief added his observations as well. When the woman visited his home, he had repeatedly observed arguments between Karen and David. David, on the other hand, was adamant that their relationship was wonderful, and rarely did the couple have arguments. When questioned about the newspaper, David replied that he had purchased it on May 21st from a shop close to his house. To have the week's weather forecast with him, he was going to bring it on the trip. When investigators visited that shop, the clerk said they did indeed sell that newspaper. He even recalled David having purchased it on January 21st. The clerk said the paper actually released that issue a few days ago, as is customary for printed newspapers. As a result, doubts about David vanished from the man noticed the absence of a white lace corset that Karen had purchased for herself a few months earlier, one that was strikingly similar to the one worn by Karen's killer. When they asked him if anything was missing from her home in the background, the detectives assumed right away that the despicable criminal had taken it as a trophy as a result of this. A finely detailed drawing of a watch bearing the name Steven Fischler's signature was discovered in the victim's home, and the police chose to follow this lead. The detectives were contacted by a specific detail. Attention blued seemed to be on the paper. The detectives asked Karen's co-workers after quickly learning that Steven and Karen were employed by the same business. They discovered a lot of fascinating data. Nearly all of the staff members described Steven as being rather strange. He made a concerted effort to win over all of his female co-workers. He showed them images that were pornographic. He even attempted to persuade his colleagues to read a pornographic poem he had written. Every single woman who worked with him acknowledged that he frightened them. Karen also expressed her displeasure with his conduct on numerous occasions, but management paid little attention. He denied giving Karen that drawing when the detectives spoke with him. In order to prove his innocence, he also said he barely knew the victim and offered to submit to a polygraph test. The most intriguing part started when the investigators swiftly set up such a test. Everything seemed to be going smoothly at first, but after one of the questions, Steven abruptly admitted that he had killed Karen. He immediately changed his mind after a brief period of time and asserted that he was unrelated to it. Strangely, the polygraph operator failed to find a lie in either situation. The detectives were perplexed by this, but were unable to rely on the polygraph results. This tool is far from ideal and simply cannot tell whether someone is telling the truth or not. They also realized that Steven was obviously a very strange person who could say anything at that moment. Soon after, experts examined his drawing and came to the conclusion that ketchup, not blood, caused the red stain. They started to wonder if Steven had anything to do with Karen's slaying. Despite having so many potential suspects, the police were unable to compile sufficient evidence to convict anyone, and the case went unsolved for a number of months. Detectives kept looking for new leads but were unsuccessful. This persisted until December, when an intriguing event took place. Residents of Gulfport organized special events to celebrate the retirement of a well-respected local. There were numerous attendees, including Mary, who struck. The murder of Karen Gregory was brought up during their conversation with an additional police officer, and Mary unintentionally mentioned that she too had heard Karen Gregory's piercing scream that night. The officer noticed a peculiar detail right away. Mary lived 2 blocks away from Karen's home, and at first the police didn't even question the occupants of such far-off homes. The scream must have been extremely loud because the woman could hear it. However, the neighborhood watch chief, who practically lived Karen's neighbor across the street, described it as muffled. But the man clearly could not consider it quiet if the neighbors 2 blocks away heard it, especially given that he was at the time in his garage with the door open. Despite the suspicions raised by all of this, the police took their time in questioning the head of the neighborhood watch. He was George Lewis, a 22-year-old. He was a firefighter by trade and was close with almost every police officer at the neighborhood police station. All the neighbors spoke highly of him and said that he lived with his wife and young child. However, the detectives were unable to disregard Mary's account. When George had some free time, they asked him to call and come to the station. The man concurred but never appeared. Before this, it should be noted, he frequently dropped by the station just to visit with his friends. It was difficult for the case's lead detective to consider George as a murderer because he was even present at his wedding. In just 1 month in January 1985, they were able to communicate with him. This scream, according to George, didn't seem to be very loud. If he remembered anything else from that evening, he thought that this might be his fault, but George told him the same thing, with the exception of the brief period when his testimony was being taken for the first time. He claimed that after hearing the scream, he exited the garage and started to walk down the street. but this time he said that he had only gone up to the road to take a look before coming back. This discrepancy in the testimonies did not seem significant given the length of time that had passed since then. Nevertheless, the police wanted to make sure he was telling the truth, so they offered to have him take a polygraph test. To their surprise, George agreed but did not share it with anyone. The man later confessed to concealing one fact from the detectives during a conversation with them. He asserted that he saw an unidentified man close to Karen's home the night she vanished. The only thing George could recall about the man was that he was tall, had red hair and a beard. Once again, the detectives questioned whether he was telling the truth. George was at a loss as to why he hadn't mentioned this man during the initial interview, but he was afraid that the man might harm his family because he knew where he lived. Despite this, the police made an effort to pursue this tip and identify the man, but they were unsuccessful. In addition, it was completely dark outside, and there were almost 30 meters between George and Karen's homes. George insisted on his account, so the police reenacted the events of that day, despite the detectives' claims that the man could see the color of another person's hair in such circumstances. At night, he approached George and asked him to describe the man standing 30 meters away. Since he was blind, the detectives were even more skeptical of what he was saying. Nevertheless, they strolled the neighborhood and questioned the populace. "Have you seen a suspicious man with red hair who might wander the streets at night?" Several women admitted, to their surprise, that they had occasionally seen a man looking into their windows while it was dark. None of them were able to make out the man's face, but one woman did, and he resembled George Lewis a lot, in her opinion. She wasn't completely sure because it was pitch black outside, and the man bolted for the door. Although George acknowledged that he occasionally peered into his neighbors' windows, he insisted that he did so only to ensure their safety. As the leader of the neighborhood watch, he claimed he was only checking to see if everything was all right with them because he was responsible for the neighborhood's security. However, all of this did was fuel suspicions against him. George consented to, and in March 1985, he changed his story once more during the second polygraph examination. He acknowledged that he saw the man in front of Karen's house, that he spoke to him, and that the man threatened to kill him if he revealed who he was to anyone. Once more, the polygraph examiner picked up on a lie, so the investigator directly questioned George, "Did he kill Karen Gregory?" The man responded negatively, and his assertions were again regarded as false. The detectives then decided to speak with George's wife, who informed them that she had awakened that night from piercing cry and was extremely terrified. Her husband was nowhere to be found when she searched the house and went to the garage, where the light was also off. After that, the woman went back home and waited in the kitchen for her husband, who didn't show up for another 30 minutes. The detectives also made the decision to investigate George's past. They spoke with his ex-wife, who revealed that while George appeared to be kind, caring, and responsible, in actuality he was extremely aggressive and frequently raised his hand to her during arguments. "He even choked," she continued. Afterward, the investigators occasionally spoke with George's close friends, who also provided some intriguing details about the months prior to the murder, when Karen wasn't yet living with him, but still paid him visits on occasion. The detectives discovered that George occasionally engaged in orgies and mentioned that he wanted Karen to join them. He also discovered that he told his friends that he liked her. The police also discovered that George had a secret in the summer of 1984 during these conversations with his friends. He had an affair with a young lady who lived a few houses away. They talked to her and discovered additional information. The girl acknowledged that George gave her a white lace corset for her 17th birthday. The man made her wear it, even though it was too big for her. When Karen's boyfriend saw the corset, the police asked her to give it to them. He claimed that a corset that was exactly like Karen's had vanished from the home and that its measurements were accurate. The first concrete evidence against George came from this, but after taking a footprint from him and sending it to FBI specialists for comparison with the footprint discovered on Karen's home's bathroom floor, the detectives dug even deeper. The results eventually returned with a perfect match. When George was summoned back to the police station in March 1986, the detectives repeatedly questioned him about whether he had been at Karen's home on the night of the murder. Up until the detective informed him of the examination's findings, the man maintained his denial. George kept denying everything for the next few minutes, but then he changed his story and told the police that he saw a red-haired man near Karen's house, ran inside, and discovered that everything was covered in blood and that Karen was lying in the hallway with a cut to her throat. He then declared that he would never again remember that horrifying experience. Of course, the detectives didn't believe his story for a second because it was so absurd. But George was correct about one thing. The victim's throat did have a cut on it that hadn't been there before. Even if his story was true, he wouldn't have been able to see the cut because there was so much blood on Karen's body if it had been made public. At least skilled medical professionals couldn't see it until the blood had been removed. This meant that unless George was the murderer, he could not have known about the cut. It took everything mentioned above for authorities to apprehend the man. His detention occurred on March 15th. He might have received the death penalty for what he did almost 2 years after the Florida murder. Although they did not share the police's conviction that George was the murderer, George's close friends and his co-workers in the fire department still thought highly of him and made every effort to assist him. These people mortgaged their homes and even donated a portion of their pay to George's wife and child, in addition to raising $300,000 for bail on his behalf. George was consequently freed in late December. He continued to reside in his home for an additional 6 months, while the trial went on until June 4, 1987. George's attorneys insisted that the man hadn't killed anyone and hadn't altered his account of what happened when speaking with the police. However, when the suspect was given the opportunity to speak, he concocted an entirely different tale. The same thing happened at the beginning. He spotted a man close to Karen's house, ran inside, and discovered her body. George was extremely ill after visiting this website, so he ran to the bathroom and puked. This appears to be how he attempted to explain there was a clear distinction here. If he had entered Karen's house barefoot at first, the bloody traces would have extended from where he discovered her body to the bathroom, but they weren't there when asked why he didn't call the police. George claimed that at the time he was only 22 years old and that he was too terrified to tell anyone. It's important to note that the man had worked as a firefighter since he was 18 and frequently encountered horrific circumstances, but when he found his neighbor dead, and for some reason, he was unable to even call the police. George had feelings for Karen for several months, the prosecution insisted. He waited until her boyfriend went away for a week before deciding to exploit the circumstance. She was assaulted by George after he broke into her home, but she was able to scream and even fight back. He eventually killed her and violently treated her. His wife thinks there might be an easy explanation for the footprint he left on the bathroom floor. Only 30 minutes had passed since the scream when he arrived home. It appears that he tried to wash the blood-stained clothes in the bathroom and removed the blood-stained socks from his shoes. The jury ultimately found him guilty after the 2-week trial. When his sentence was about to be announced a month later, the judge abruptly set the date for a new trial. It was successfully pushed through by George's attorneys. They insisted that the police had tampered with some of the evidence and that the prosecution had not been able to fully investigate. All parties involved in the process were taken aback by the judge's decision because it is unusual and required them to show their client's guilt. The prosecutor was able to appeal this choice, and it was overturned in 1989. George ultimately received a life sentence. The man had no prior criminal history, so the death penalty was ruled out. Since then, George has made several attempts to appeal his sentence but has been rejected each time. Many of his friends and family members still thought he was, despite all the information and proof against him, he is innocent. 52-year-old George passed away while incarcerated in 2014. He remained adamantly innocent up until the very end, even speaking in an interview about how difficult it was to endure the punishment for a crime he did not commit. It's important to note one thing. However, none of the 16 neighbors who heard Karen scream dared to call the police. The patrol could have quickly arrived at the scene because the police station was close by their street. The detectives working on this case quickly acknowledged that Karen's life might have been saved in this situation, but it was not. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching. The student got off the bus and was nowhere to be found. Without a trace, her body was found in a field the next day. The police looked for the killer for 39 years, but it was not until 2019 that they were able to find out what really happened. We will tell you what happened. Helene Brzezinski was born on April 6, 1958, in Huntington, which is near New York City. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her older brother and sister were 12 and 9 years old, respectively. The girl grew up with love and care, got along well with her older relatives, and was a positive, bright person. When she was 14, her father got a job offer, and the family had to move to the small town of Hamilton near Boston. There, she went to the local school and developed a passion for after high school. She went to Wheaton College, which was 110 kilometers from her town. It was close enough for her to visit her family often, and it also had a great writing program. Helen got used to being a college student quickly. She did well in school and was involved in college life. Eventually, she got a chance she was excited about. She was going to do an internship at a radio news station in Denver, even though the city was more than 3,000 miles away from our college. Helene was excited about the opportunity. In addition, her uncle and aunt lived in Denver and agreed to take her in for the internship. She also went with a classmate who studied journalism in January 1980. Helen, then 21, flew to Denver and began working at a radio station. Every day she had to take the bus from the office to her home. The trip took about 30 minutes, after which she had to walk several miles. On January 16th, she left the radio station as usual at 6 p.m. and went to the bus stop. The only thing was that she never showed up at home. Her aunt immediately began to worry because Helen had always warned her before. If she planned to be somewhere late, the woman waited a few hours. But at 11:30 she decided to go to the police. After all, investigators had already begun a search, immediately fearing that her disappearance might be connected to a recent string of attacks on women in the area. They combed the area along Helen's route all night, but could not find her in the morning. A woman approached the police. She was driving her car through a suburban area of Denver with her children. At one point they noticed someone lying in a field near the road. The mother stopped. The car walked closer and saw the body of a young girl with no signs of life. The police arrived on the scene and immediately identified Helen. Her clothes were partially missing, her hands were tied behind her back, and all her personal belongings were also missing. Later, medical experts determined that the girl had been stabbed 9 times and abused. The death occurred between 8 and 10 p.m. A person who saw Helene get off the bus at 5:30 was able to be found by the cops. She had several kilometers to walk from the bus stop, and it appears that the perpetrator attacked her at that point. Law enforcement agencies surveyed the area near where the body was found, but they were unable to find almost any clues other than shoe impressions, presumably size 44, that led from the road to the body and back. By then, medical examiners had found biological material on the victim's body and clothing that appeared belonged to the killer, except that in those years it could not help the investigation, because the science of studying DNA was only at an early stage of development. But the samples were sent to a laboratory for storage, hoping that they would help identify the perpetrator in the future. Police turned to the public for information using newspapers and local television. They tried to find witnesses who might have seen Helen that night. Soon they were approached by a woman who, at about 10:20 p.m., saw a man near the field where the body was found. He was standing on the side of the road next to a car. Unfortunately, it was dark outside at the time, and the woman could not get a good look at the man she provided the police with, only generalities that could not help them in any way. Then the detectives took a very interesting step with the consent of the witness. They invited a hypnotist to the station, and the woman was able to remember more details, on the basis of which it turned out to draw a portrait of this unknown man. It is hard to say whether the hypnosis session really helped the investigation, but the fact remains that at that time the police had nothing but this drawing, but they could not find a single suspect, and the case froze for years. Helen's college diploma was given to her after she died as a way to remember her. The school also named an alumni award after her because she was always involved in college life. the investigation was not reopened until 1998. 18 years after the murder by then, technology in the field of DNA research had progressed markedly, and researchers had entered samples of biological material into the FBI database. Unfortunately, no matches were found. This meant that the perpetrator had no previous criminal convictions, at least not since they began taking DNA samples from convicts 15 more years past. And in 2013, the local police department created a unit to handle unsolved cases. They reopened the investigation into Helen's murder, but no new leads could be found. A DNA sample from the victim's body never showed up in the FBI database. This meant the girl's killer had not come to the attention of the police for other possible crimes all this time. Throughout all these years, Helen's relatives and police were not the only ones trying to find the truth. The girl's high school friends with whom she was in the choir took an active part in the investigation. Decades after her murder, they continued to press detectives to review the case regularly. They also gave interviews to get the story out to the public and distributed flyers about Helen's murder along her bus route. In 2017, the case was reopened again, and this time the detectives had much more to go on by this point. Forensics had begun to make extensive use of genetic genealogy, by which the perpetrator's identity could be deduced through his relatives. Of course, this was a very complicated and time-consuming process. Moreover, this method worked only in the case if the relatives of the DNA possessor were in the publicly available genetic databases. There are several of these, and they are mostly used to search for family members. In 2018, police turned over available DNA samples to the Parabon lab, which had already helped solve hundreds of similar cases. Experts looked at about 3,000 matches, including even distant relatives of the alleged killer. They had to get rid of people who did not fit the age range or could not have committed the crime for other reasons. In the end, they decided that the person with the DNA was probably the son of a woman named June Estes, who was dead at the time. The problem was that she had 4 sons, but the lab was only able to identify 2 of them. They were 10 and 11 years old. A year went by before something unexpected happened. A woman named Jessie put her DNA sample into a public database, which was the best way to find criminals. Experts at Parabon saw that Jessie was a close relative of Helen's killer and contacted her. After a more detailed DNA test, they found that Jessie's 3rd cousin was the killer. Detectives asked the woman for information about her family to finally find the suspect. Immediately after uploading her data into the database, the woman began collecting information about her family tree and asked both of her parents to enter their DNA into the database. Through this, experts at Parabon determined that the killer was related to Jessie on her father's side. Unfortunately, the search for an answer will drag on for several more months. Expert detectives and Jessie's family worked together to get closer to the owner of the DNA from the murder scene, and soon it finally happened. The cops were able to reach a relative of June Estes, and he gave new details about her older sons. It turned out that the woman suffered from mental problems, and after her next breakdown, her father took the boys and took them to another town. Their names were William and Curtis, and the detectives were to find out which one of them was the killer. The answer was not long in coming. The Cavs immediately discovered that William had been incarcerated multiple times, and his DNA sample was entered into the FBI database in 2010. Given that the sample from Helen's body has been run through that database repeatedly since then, William was not the killer. The downside of this database is that it only shows a full match, not a partial match, even when brothers are involved. 39 years after the murder, the police had a prime suspect named Curtis White, who also went by the last name Clanton. It turned out that this man had a long criminal history. When he was 18, he knocked on a woman's door and asked to use her phone. Once inside, he grabbed a knife and abused the victim before running away. He was quickly caught and sentenced to 30 years in prison, but he was released after only 4 years because he was defended. Curtis moved in and got a job as a gardener in the area where Helen was killed. He later moved to Florida, which is where the officers went to look for him in 2019. Curtis was 62 years old at the time and worked as a trucker. Before charging him with Helen's murder, investigators wanted more hard evidence. After a week's surveillance, they got a hidden DNA sample from him, but it wasn't enough. Followed to a club, he confessed to a brutal murder. Life sentence granted at 82. Victim's family found closure after almost 40 years. Other cases possibly linked but unproven. Justice served partially. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like the video if you like it. Thanks for watching. In June 2000, 15-year-old Leah Freeman vanished, leaving a small town in shock. With rumors swirling and a distraught boyfriend, Nick McGuffin, desperately searching, the police investigation took unexpected twists. Witness testimonies, concealed evidence, and advanced DNA testing would lead to revelations and suspicions. Dive into the mysteries and uncover the truth behind Leah Freeman's disappearance in this video. At 10:15 p.m. on June 28, 2000, the Courtwright home received a call. The phone was answered by Corey Courtwright. Nick McGuffin, Leah's 18-year-old boyfriend, was the one who inquired as to her whereabouts. Nick had picked up Leah from their house about 4 p.m., which caught Corey off guard. Little did she realize the difficulties she would face in the future. Nick McGuffin, who was 3 years older than Leah Freeman, went to the same school as her. The two young people finally began dating after becoming acquaintances at some time. This alarmed Leah's mother, Corey, who had learned that her daughter and Nick shared more than just a spiritual bond. They also had a physical one. Around 4 p.m. on that day, Nick drove up in his vintage Mustang to pick up Leah. Leah bid her mom bye before leaving in the car. The young pair enjoyed listening to loud music while driving. Nick claims that he dropped Leah off at the home of her closest friend Sherry at around 7 o'clock. They agreed that he would pick her up from there at 9 o'clock. But when he arrived there, Leah was gone, and the guy Leah was staying with told him that they had gotten into a fight, which caused Leah to get furious and leave. Leah was nowhere to be found when Nick started driving around the streets looking for her. Nick encouraged Corey not to worry and reassured her that he would locate Leah and bring her home at around 7 a.m. as their chat came to an end. On June 29th, still waiting for her daughter to come home, Corey called Nick's house to inquire about her whereabouts. Shortly after they reported her missing to the police at the station, Nick was shocked because he thought she was at home. Leah climbed into the car with Nick, and Corey recalled the moment she last saw her daughter. He claimed that after speaking with Leah's mother on the phone, he kept driving around the city looking for the teenager, substantiating his allegation that Nick had been stopped by the police twice the day before, owing to he was pulled over by the police on several occasions, all of which he stated he was looking for Leah. He asked his buddy Kristen Steinhoff for assistance after being stopped for the second time owing to a problem with the car. They then drove around the city for nearly an hour in her car, but it did not work, and they went their separate ways. According to Nick, he then made the decision to walk close to Leah's house once more. Around 2 a.m., I noticed a light inside of her. He went back to his own house with peace of mind, assuming she was already there. Starting with his friend whom he had left Leah with the night before, the cops started looking into what Nick had disclosed. Sherry corroborated Nick's account by stating that Leah had visited her home yesterday, but fled following their disagreement. Sherry explained that Leah wanted to go for a run, but her mother wouldn't let her since Leah often gets in trouble for asking to go for a run. Nick picks her up, sending her home alone. Leah heard her friend and her mother having this chat, became offended, and left Sherry's home right away. Sherry claimed that she attempted to stop Leah, but that she was enraged and continued to leave. And while Leah was at Sherry's, Nick spent time with his friends at a nearby lake, according to his friends. Later, the authorities produced evidence indicating the young people had met there with a purpose, and Nick's involvement was a key factor in their plan. Leah loathed him and their disagreement very much. Kristen, a friend of Nick's, also corroborated his claim that they were looking for Leah in her car. There have never been any high-profile crimes in Kokio, a little town with a population of just under 4,000. The disappearance of Leah Freeman raised a lot of controversy in the neighborhood. When Leah left her friend's home, the police looked for any witnesses who may have seen her. It was discovered that she was last observed alone in a downtown area close to her school. It's possible that she was on her way home, but it has now been discovered that she never arrived. Leah's mother disputed the police's assertion that her daughter had simply run away from home, saying her daughter had no justification for doing so. Nick's home and car were the subject of search warrants issued by the police. The only noteworthy discovery of the car search was the missing lining in the trunk. Otherwise, it was absolutely empty and devoid of any tools or a spare tire. The detectives found nothing of significance in the house. His father, Nick, began to understand that he had changed from my witness to the only suspect during the interrogation, when it was stated that everything had been taken out because of a fuel leak. Nick attempted to disregard the accusations that he was somehow connected to Leah's abduction, as he kept looking for his loved one by distributing flyers bearing her picture. 3 days after Leah Freeman vanished, something happened that caused the police's perception to shift away from the idea that the young woman might have been abducted. The woman had fled. Near the school where Leah was last seen, a man who worked at a nearby vehicle service business approached the police. He recalled that on the night of the young woman's disappearance, he had been working late and was about to leave when he saw a shoe by the roadside that looked like one of his kids' sneakers, which they occasionally brought to his business. He took it home after picking it up. The father didn't recall anything until Leah's disappearance caused a stir. He turned it over to the police after assuring them it wasn't his children's. The footwear belonged to Leah, according to the young woman's family, who confirmed this. It was discovered on Northern Elm Street close to the local school and cemetery. Her right foot belongs in the sneaker. It was Leah Freeman's shoes, according to the results of the forensic investigation. A week later, something was found that clearly suggested the missing young woman had suffered a terrible fate. In the second sneaker Leah owned, it was in the Hudson Ridge area, about 7.5 miles from where the first sneaker was discovered, on an old logging road, a remote location where one might easily conceal themselves from prying eyes. A forensic examination of the sneaker revealed dry stains of a dark red hue that contained Leah Freeman's biological material. Leah's mother claims that the police didn't start treating her daughter's absence seriously, or stop thinking her a runaway until the sneaker was found. Were organized by the police to search the area after a second shoe was discovered. On August 3, 2000, 5 weeks after Leah Freeman vanished, one of the search teams detected a strong stench and found her body. Leah's mother, Corey Courtwright, had been holding on to the hope that her daughter would finally return home. In the vicinity of Lee Valley Road, it had been hurled over the brink of a narrow brook. The area was very forested, and there was no one there. If not for the potent stink, the body might have remained unnoticed for a lot longer. The murderer had picked a decent location nearby to conceal the body. The prolonged exposure of the body to the high temperature caused extensive decomposition, making it impossible for investigators to collect any usable evidence. Another factor was the local police's inexperience with such investigations. The map reveals the following. Leah was last seen close to the school, not far from where her right shoe was discovered. The body was recovered 2.5 miles from the place where the left sneaker was found, which was located 5 miles from the right one. The cops were further perplexed by the body's detachment from the shoes. As a result, after the body was discovered, the inquiry stalled rather than making the anticipated progress. The police were reticent to divulge anything, and it was clear from the lack of any arrests or charges that they had no solid leads. Meanwhile, rumors started to circulate despite the fact that the young man appeared to be grieving over his loved one's passing. Most people in the small village of Coquille think that Leah's boyfriend, Nick McGuffin, was involved in everything and was concealing something. The majority of people accused him. As they had no other suspects, the police again called him in for interrogation. Despite their pressure, however, there were no breakthroughs in the investigation. It became clear that the investigation had reached a standstill a year later. Police did not have any fresh suspects. Nick. After another 6 years passed, the small town that was shaken by the high-profile crime slowly returned to normal. In 2007, Nick's daughter was born, and society started to accept him again. However, for Leah's mother, Corey Courtwright, life seemed to have stopped the day she lost her daughter. She never stopped reminding the local police chief about the unsolved case 8 years later. The detectives were unpleasantly surprised to find that the evidence gathered in 2000 was dispersed, and some of it was completely useless. Witness testimonies from that time were reviewed, and dozens of people were interviewed once more, including Kristen Steinhoff, Nick's friend. Mark Daniels took over the Coquille police, and he gave the case a fresh perspective by assembling a team of specialists from across the state. Her remarks on the night of her disappearance were different from what she had claimed 8 years prior. She recalled how Nick visited her home that evening about midnight, and the two of them had a cigarette. Nick then began kissing her. But it didn't last long since she objected. Nick McGuffin was called in for additional questioning after her testimony rekindled earlier suspicions about him. Kristen's testimony was corroborated, and he acknowledged that what she had stated was accurate, but he had been reluctant to do so in 2000 when the police had publicly suggested that Leah might have the most surprising development was the appearance of a witness years later who claimed to have seen Leah and Nick after she left her friend's house. Leah was only 15 at the time, which could have provided a motive for Nick to commit the crime and could have landed him in jail. Leah Freeman's body was discovered on August 23, 2010, 10 years after she passed away. Her boyfriend Nick McGuffin was taken into custody and accused of being the cause of death. The prosecution used the testimony of 2 witnesses during the trial. Leah and Nick were allegedly seen by a witness at 9 o'clock. The day she vanished, close to the establishment where the first pair of sneakers was discovered. Nick allegedly tried to drag Gila into a car as they were shouting. According to the prosecution, it was at this time when Nick allegedly hurt Leah, as evidenced by the stains on the shoes. Someone who claimed to have had an argument with Nick in 2002 and that Nick had threatened to treat him the same way he treated Leah was the second and most significant witness. This accusation was understood as this witness was the ex-boyfriend of the young lady Nick subsequently married, which would have influenced his testimony, but the prosecutor ruled out the likelihood of prejudice. Nick McGuffin refused to confess guilt, but in the absence of any tangible proof, he only had the testimony of witnesses. Nick McGuffin was found guilty of Leah Freeman's involuntary manslaughter by 10 of the jury's 12 members. When the verdict was revealed on July 19, 2011, 11 years after she passed away, he received an 11-year prison term. The mother experienced her first moment of comfort upon learning that the person who had kidnapped her daughter was now in jail, but the narrative doesn't end there. In 2014, Nick McGuffin's relentless insistence on his innocence and his prolific letter writing to multiple human rights organizations produced results. One of these organizations became interested in his case, and Jazz Parakow, his new attorney, started looking into the facts and witness accounts that had led to the guilty conviction. As she learned, in addition to the police concealed vital information that would have impacted the jury's verdict due to the lack of tangible proof connecting Nick McGuffin to the killing of Leah Freeman. The fact that Leah's clothing contained traces of gray automotive paint that did not coincide with the hue of Nick's car during the trial was kept a secret. Although it was stated that the Mustang's interior had been completely cleaned when it was originally checked, pictures from that time clearly showed otherwise. Witness statements disputed the prosecution's witnesses' assertions that I witnessed Leah and Nick fighting outside the school at around 9 o'clock. But these unreported testimonies claim they weren't brought up in court. Leah was seen by witness Nick Backman at 9 o'clock. Leah was out on her own that evening while he was at an ATM. Additionally, the authorities seized the ATM videotape, which showed that his meeting occurred at precisely 9:04 p.m. In the 10 years between the discovery of the corpse and the footwear and Nick McGuffin's arrest, during which time technology advanced, one of the most serious instances of police professionalism occurred, had significantly progressed, especially in the area of DNA testing. As is well known, one of the sneakers identified as containing Leah Freeman's biological material in 2000 had significant crimson stains. The police mysteriously chose not to send the footwear for more examination after 10 years, and the chance to learn more using new technologies. This decision ultimately had a big impact on Nick McGuffin's life. The attorney got in touch with the lab that had tested the shoes in order to request a copy of the original DNA analysis result in 2000 and was shocked to learn that, in addition to Leah's DNA, his DNA had also been discovered on the footwear. However, the male DNA was so minute that at the time, technology could not further identify it, and its discovery was no longer mentioned anywhere in the police records. Nevertheless, the police decided not to conduct a further investigation in 2010, despite having all the available options. The footwear were submitted for re-examination in 2017, thanks to Nick's defense, and the results showed that both male and female DNA was present. However, the detected samples were so small that it was impossible to obtain comprehensive information for comparison with the FBI database. They could only reveal similarities when compared directly to the DNA of the person who left them. The sneakers, both inside and outside, did not belong to Nick McGuffin. Nick McGuffin's guilty judgment was reversed on November 29, 2019, and his case was given back to the prosecutor who had been in charge of it during the 2011 trial. The prosecutor claimed that simply because McGuffin was found guilty was overturned doesn't mean he's innocent, given that Nick had already completed nearly all of his 11-year sentence and the new evidence. The prosecutor chose not to pursue a new trial against him. On December 17, 2019, Nick McGuffin was released from prison. He now intends to hold the authorities accountable for erasing 10 years from his life. The investigation into Leah Freeman's killing is still ongoing, but possibly new techniques will one day be developed that will allow for a more precise identification of the murderer. Mom Corey Cartwright is still of the opinion that the individual is Nick McGuffin. Share your opinion about this story in the comments and don't forget to like this video. If you enjoyed it, thank you for watching.